Hi everyone, welcome back to Radio Night Crime. Before you drift off, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now let's relax and jump into tonight's case. Story 1. Have you ever wondered how far people might go for love? But what if that love isn't what it seems? What if everything you see is a carefully woven web of lies and manipulation, and the main character in this story is caught up in their own fantasies? A multimillionaire from Wales, a man who seemingly had it all, found himself trapped in his own illusions. What led him to turn his life into a nightmare, pulling down those around him in the process? In this story, there are no easy answers, and honestly, you'll be stunned to discover just how far emotions and passions push things to a tragic end. Pay close attention to every detail, because there's far less truth here than you might think. The Welsh tycoon and multimillionaire Peter Morgan, once at the height of his success and possessing wealth beyond imagination, suddenly found himself on the brink of disaster. His life, outwardly filled with prosperity and flawless harmony, hid behind its facade the shadows that often consume those facing a midlife crisis. A crisis that shatters the usual routine and pushes a person to grasp at the opportunities they missed in their youth, leading them down a dangerous path. This story begins on a quiet Welsh morning. In an old manor that served as a retreat for those seeking solace within its thick walls, two women sat on a sofa, sharing their secrets. In a bungalow tucked away in the dense woods, one of them confessed that her lover, who had once brought her joy, had become nothing but a source of frustration. She was on the brink of making a decision that would change everything. Meanwhile, miles away, a man sat in his home, clutching his cell phone. His fingers trembled, as if trying to hold onto the last fragments of his peace. Just a moment earlier, he had heard words that would alter his life forever. This story unfolded in Wales in 2016, centered around Peter Morgan, a man with a long history of success and affluence. Born in 1962 on a 300-acre farm near Newport, he grew up in a family that had no financial worries. From a young age, he understood that his future was already set. He would become a farmer just like his parents. However, even then, Peter showed signs of entitlement and apathy toward education. He envisioned his life in the simplest terms, never imagining stepping outside the familiar boundaries. At 16, he dropped out of school to work in the family business, which, despite his lack of formal education, proved to be a stable source of income. Peter lived a predictable life for many years, working on the farm, marrying a childhood friend, and settling down in the small town of Usk with his two daughters. The comfort and stability of family life satisfied him for a while, but when he turned 30, Peter decided to change his fate. He left the farm and started building his own business, one that, while not particularly exciting, was highly successful. Starting with poultry barns, he developed a network of industrial chicken houses. The business thrived, and by the time he turned 40, Peter sold it for a seven-figure sum. This became a turning point for him. The midlife crisis crept in quietly, but its effects were immediate and devastating. It was as if Peter transformed overnight from a sensible businessman into a man obsessed with experiencing life in all its intensity and chaos. He began spending money as if there were no tomorrow, buying luxury cars like Ferraris and Lamborghinis, and outfitting his newly acquired mansion with extravagant items, including a tank and a helicopter. His fascination with weapons also became evident. An AK-47 rested on the desk in his office. But that was only the outward appearance. The changes in his life went far deeper than just financial extravagance. During a business trip to Amsterdam, Peter crossed a boundary for the first time at a private club, paying a performer for an intimate service. This marked his first act of infidelity, awakening an overwhelming desire to continue. From that moment on, Peter led a double life. On one side, family and stability. On the other, luxury and indulgence in forbidden pleasures. By 2011, his life took a new turn. At a private club, a friend told Peter about an app where one could book elite escorts. This conversation marked the beginning of his downfall. Once back home, Peter dove into the digital world where fantasies became reality. Soon, he spent all his free time browsing profiles and arranging meetings with escorts across the country, from Newport to Cardiff. Each encounter was new and unique, as Morgan made it a rule never to meet the same woman twice. It was his personal escape from his family life, which he cleverly disguised as business trips. His wife Helen suspected nothing. Peter had become skilled at covering his tracks, framing his escapades as work-related travel, while Helen, likely caught up in her own responsibilities, didn't notice how her husband was living a double life. Everything changed in 2012 when Peter celebrated his 50th birthday. It was then that he met Georgina Simons, a young and energetic 22-year-old woman. Georgina was born and raised in Newport in a family with 3 brothers. She had a strong personality, headstrong, and confident. She dropped out of school at 16, got a job at a call center, and simultaneously enrolled in cosmetology courses. Georgina's relationship with Peter Deem, a man 6 years her senior, once seemed like a reliable path to a stable future. But her life began to shift when she gave birth to her daughter, Emily, at the age of 17. Becoming a mother, she tried to adjust to her new role, but soon she met someone who would completely change the course of her life, Peter Morgan. As a young mother, Georgina Simons tried to settle into her new life at Peter's mother's house, where they lived together with their young daughter. Her job at a call center brought in barely enough to get by, and every morning, waking up in the damp, unwelcoming house, she knew she wanted more. She was convinced that she deserved better, more money, more freedom, more excitement. Bored with the monotony of her days spent on the phone in a stifling office, she craved something more, something that would fill her life with meaning and luxury. Georgina often complained about how little they earned and how they were forced to cut corners on everything because of it. Her boyfriend, Pete, was a calm, home-orientated guy, uninterested in parties or a flashy lifestyle. Unlike Georgina, he was content with stability and routine, but his desire for a quiet, simple life increasingly frustrated her. Feeling trapped and unable to see another way out, Georgina decided to use her appearance to earn a living. The young woman became almost obsessed with her image. She began dressing provocatively, experimenting with makeup, and diving into the possibilities of cosmetic surgery. Soon, she underwent 2 breast augmentation surgeries, had liposuction, and took lessons in burlesque and exotic dancing. This opened the door to a world where money flowed freely. Working at a private dance club, she started earning sums she had only dreamed about before. She committed to a complete transformation, aiming to attract the attention of wealthy men who were willing to pay for her company. At this point, her life started to change. Georgina managed to move herself and Pete out of his mother's house and into their own apartment, and for a while, she felt like she had finally gained some independence. But it wasn't enough. Her ambitions and thirst for luxury grew stronger every day. Before long, her work at the club no longer satisfied her desires, and she began contemplating the next step, working as a high-end escort. She justified it to herself as a way to secure a better future for her daughter. She registered on a popular app under the alias Hannah James, offering various services for substantial amounts. Georgina knew her looks and skills would attract wealthy clients, and she was right. Pete, despite knowing about Georgina's plans, was against the idea. He understood the risks that came with those types of encounters, and didn't want his partner to engage in such work. However, his love for Georgina and the fear of losing her led him to a compromise. The couple agreed to an open relationship, allowing Georgina to continue her escort work under the condition that it would remain hidden from their families. Her services and private life were kept behind the curtain, a secret accessible only to select clients. Georgina's profile on the multimillionaire struggling with a midlife crisis stumbled upon her picture. He was immediately captivated and arranged a meeting. During their first date, Peter and Georgina had dinner, chatting about casual things, and Peter felt a connection he had been missing. He was drawn not only to her looks, but also to her confidence. That evening he paid her $200 for a kiss, but by morning, the amount had grown significantly. For Georgina, it was just work, but for Peter, it was something more. Up until this point, Peter had never met the same woman twice, preferring variety. But Georgina was different. He was willing to pay for her time over and over again, and their meetings increased from once a month to once a week. Peter realized he was falling for her. He loved being around her, and money was no longer an issue. He was paying not just for her services, but for her company. They went to movies and restaurants together, and Morgan showered her with gifts, clothes, shoes, expensive jewelry, and even a red Ferrari at one point. Over time, his feelings began to morph into an obsession. Peter wanted Georgina by his side as much as possible. He no longer saw her as just an escort. To him, she was a companion, something much more. His wife and children would go away for the weekend, unaware that another woman was spending time with him in their family home. For one such weekend, Peter paid Georgina $10,000 to stay with him. Peter's wife, Helen, had no idea that scenes playing out in her bedroom could shatter their marriage. For Georgina, it was all just business. She wasn't interested in Peter's growing obsession. For her, the focus was solely on the money he so generously spent. She continued to see other clients without a hint of remorse. Even her boyfriend, Pete, remained in her life despite her relationship with Morgan. But this didn't deter Peter. The only thing that bothered him was the idea of other clients also spending time with Georgina. The thought of sharing her was unbearable, so he decided to offer her something more: exclusive rights. Morgan was prepared to pay an enormous sum for Georgina to be with him exclusively, and she agreed. She knew she could earn more from one client than from dozens of others. From then on, Georgina met only with Peter, receiving around $133,000 per month. This amount covered her living expenses, food, and personal costs. And for a while, it seemed like everything was under control. But their arrangement was about to trigger events that would change their lives forever. The old estate, which felt detached from reality, became a kind of prison for Georgina and her daughter. Peter Morgan, intoxicated by his believed he controlled every aspect of his new princess's life. He moved Georgina into a small bungalow on the estate's grounds, insisting it was for her and her child's safety since the main house was too run down. As part of their agreement, her boyfriend, Pete DM, was strictly forbidden from setting foot on the property, a condition Morgan imposed to isolate Georgina completely. This secluded life in a world of luxury went on for 3 years. Peter did everything in his power to create a fairy tale illusion for Georgina. Expensive gifts, trips to London, and vacations in other cities, including a lavish holiday in South Africa. He paid for her cosmetic treatments and made a point of being with her as much as possible. In his mind, Georgina had become more than just an escort. She was like family. They rode ATVs across the estate, watched movies together, strolled down manicured paths, and shared intimate moments. Peter felt incredibly happy, completely absorbed in his fantasy. But beneath all this outward luxury, cracks were beginning to show. Despite living in a castle, Georgina still viewed Peter as just a client and continued to perform her duties without attachment. The more time she spent with Morgan, the less her boyfriend, Pete DM, could see her. He struggled with her absence and the growing distance between their worlds. Trying to change the situation, Pete began focusing on self-improvement, working out, changing his appearance, and making efforts to become more attractive to Georgina. He lost weight, upgraded his wardrobe with designer clothes, and even whitened his teeth, hoping this would win back her attention. But the reality turned out to be much harsher than he had anticipated. Meanwhile, Helen, Peter's wife, started to sense that something was wrong. For a long time, she had ignored her husband's suspicious business trips, but everything changed when she discovered a receipt for flowers sent to another woman. She realized her husband had been unfaithful for some time, but instead of confronting him, she distanced herself even more, immersing herself in her daily routine. It seemed like she was content with this arrangement, or perhaps she simply didn't want to get involved. At the same time, Georgina began referring to her partners as Rich Pete and Poor Pete, clearly favoring the former. This nickname humiliated Pete Deem, making him feel like even more of a failure. Life in the castle, surrounded by luxury but disconnected from reality, continued. Georgina spent days and nights with Morgan, while her daughter grew up isolated from her father. During this period, her relationship with Pete Deem completely deteriorated, but Georgina remained indifferent, viewing Morgan solely as a source of income. For every encounter with Georgina, Peter paid additional fees, which amounted to thousands of dollars. This allowed Georgina to maintain her lavish lifestyle. To keep things interesting, she started bringing other women into the castle, and Peter found this added excitement appealing. He enjoyed these situations, often asking Georgina to find new women each time, though he still insisted she remain his main companion. One time, while his wife and kids were away on vacation, Peter invited Georgina and one of her escort friends to his family home. They spent the evening having fun in the marital bedroom, but Morgan wanted more. He asked one of the women to wear Helen's dress, acting out his fantasy of a trio involving himself, Georgina, and his wife. He knew in reality Helen would never agree to such a scenario, but that didn't stop him. In the moment when his fantasy finally came to life, Peter had no idea that Georgina was filming everything. She recorded every minute of the night, from her friend changing into Peter's wife's dress, to all the events that unfolded in the bedroom. This footage would later play a significant role in the chain of events to come. The affair continued, but Morgan's life began to unravel. First, Georgina's boyfriend, Pete Deem, reached his breaking point. He could no longer tolerate that his partner was spending more time with Morgan than with him and their daughter. At a certain point, he decided to end their relationship, and this was the first crack in Georgina's life. Not long after, Peter's wife, Helen, discovered the truth. She accidentally found messages between her husband and Georgina, and realizing the extent of the infidelity, she decided to stop turning a blind eye. Peter tried to explain, admitting everything, but Helen wasn't willing to listen anymore. She filed for divorce, demanding a significant share of their assets. Georgina's life was hit with two tragedies in quick succession, events that she couldn't overcome. The first occurred in mid-2015, when her father took his own life. The event completely shattered her. Before she could recover from that loss, she faced another tragedy. Her ex-boyfriend, Pete Deem, also took his own life. After their breakup, he fell into a deep depression, unable to cope with living without Georgina and their daughter. In November 2015, he was found hanging in a wooded area. These events were the final straw. The once confident and strong Georgina fell into a deep depression. Alcohol and prohibited substances became her companions as her life started to fall apart. She couldn't handle the pain and loss, which pulled her into a darkness that seemed impossible to escape. Over time, the relationship between Peter and Georgina deteriorated. She began to distance herself, coldly ignoring his attempts to keep their connection alive. Deep down, Georgina blamed him for the death of her former partner, Pete. In her eyes, he was the one who had ruined her life, and she sought comfort in the company of another man, a longtime friend she had known for years. With him, she felt free from control and pressure, and their relationship started to grow. For Georgina, it was an opportunity to escape the hold Morgan had over her, and to feel genuine support and care. However, the presence of this new man deeply unsettled Peter. Morgan, who had come to view Georgina as his possession, was not willing to accept her spending time with anyone else. He constantly reminded her of the money he had invested in her life, providing for her and her daughter, and in his eyes that entitled him to control over her. Peter increasingly treated her as his property, and this became more obvious over time. The more he tried to control her, the more defiant she became. Georgina stopped tolerating his demands and accusations. At every event they attended together, she didn't hesitate to insult him publicly, belittling him and making him feel worthless. Her stubborn and fiery personality was now turning against him. Her behavior became increasingly destructive. Georgina sank deeper into a world of prohibited substances and alcohol, attempting to numb the pain of her losses and disappointments. Her use of mind-altering substances intensified, and rumors of her unhealthy lifestyle reached Child Protective Services. Authorities initiated an investigation, concerned about whether Georgina was fit to be a mother to her daughter, Emily. When Simons learned about the inquiry, her first reaction was to blame Peter. She was convinced that he had alerted the social services to increase his control over her life. There was no evidence to suggest that Morgan had any involvement, but Georgina refused to listen to any explanations. In her eyes, he was responsible for all her misfortunes, and she decided to confront him directly, sparking a major confrontation. This scandal became the climax of the growing tension between them. Peter, a man used to control, couldn't let her go. He began spying on Georgina, determined to monitor her every move. Leveraging his access to the estate, he installed listening devices in the bungalow where Georgina lived. Each of these devices contained a SIM card, allowing him to call and listen to what was happening in the room. Sitting at home, Peter would dial into the devices daily, eavesdropping on her conversations. This surveillance obsession escalated into a full-blown fixation. He would call the devices up to 10 times a day, spending hours listening to recordings to see if Georgina was being unfaithful or plotting against him. More than 2 months passed, and most of the conversations Peter eavesdropped on were uneventful: chats with her daughter, small talk with friends. But on January 10, 2016, everything changed. That day, Georgina had a close friend over, and the conversation took a different turn. When Peter dialed in to listen, he overheard Georgina venting about him. She expressed that her life with Peter had become a nightmare, but she felt trapped because of his financial support. She blamed him for involving child services in her life and admitted she felt like a prisoner in the estate. Fortunately for Georgina, the child services investigation had ended, and she was not at risk of losing custody of her daughter. However, she had no intention of sharing this outcome with Morgan. She realized she could use this situation to manipulate him further, leveraging his emotions to get more money. Georgina knew that the threat of losing her daughter was a powerful tool to control Peter, and she wasn't going to miss the opportunity to exploit it for everything she could get. But her plan went even further. Peter listened, as Georgina openly told her friend that she intended to trick him into signing the bungalow over to her before cutting ties with him for good. Moreover, she had a trump card: the compromising video recording of the night they were together with her friend, who had dressed up in Peter's wife's dress. She planned to blackmail Morgan, threatening to show the footage to his ex-wife and daughters. Hearing her scheme, Peter realized everything was at stake. It became clear to him that Georgina intended to destroy his life, using his own vulnerabilities against him. At that moment, he felt his entire world collapsing beneath him. He knew that if his daughters found out about the recording, they would want nothing to do with him, and his friends and associates would turn their backs on him. Everything he had built could crumble in an instant. Listening to these revelations in the silence of his home, Peter Morgan felt a rush of emotions, from shock to rage. He couldn't believe that the woman he trusted was plotting such a betrayal. Her words diminished everything he had done for her, revealing their relationship to be an illusion where he was merely a puppet. On January 11th, barely making it through the night, Peter began to devise a plan for revenge, meticulously thinking through each step to regain control of his life. The very next day, his search history on his phone showed his intentions. He was looking up everything he might need to execute his plan. On January 12th, Peter Morgan went to a hardware store and purchased rope, zip ties, plastic bags, and rubber gloves. As soon as he returned to the estate, he headed straight for the bungalow where Georgina lived. This time, he didn't bother with pleasantries. He immediately confronted her, stating that he knew about her plans. He accused her of blackmail and made it clear that he wouldn't allow things to unfold that way. In a desperate attempt to keep her, Peter threw a pile of cash at her feet, promising everything, from marriage to a share of his wealth. He even offered to take out a life insurance policy, naming her as the beneficiary, promising $1 million if anything happened to him. But instead of accepting his offer, she coldly rejected him. Her words, filled with hatred and contempt, ignited a blind rage in Peter. He tried to intimidate her, grabbing the rope and looping it around her neck, intending only to scare her. However, when Georgina threatened that he would pay for everything, his intentions shifted. All the anger, desperation, and disappointment inside him culminated in a brutal act. Peter tightened the rope, closing his eyes, and continued until she stopped breathing. When Georgina Simon's life slipped away, Peter didn't feel relief, only emptiness. He put on the rubber gloves, bound her wrists and ankles with zip ties, and wrapped her body in plastic. He then transported her to an old family property where his family once lived, hiding her in an outbuilding, thinking no one would find her there. But his haste and carelessness became his undoing. The security cameras he had personally installed captured every move, and Georgina's mobile phone, which he forgot to turn off, allowed authorities to track her location. When Georgina didn't show up to pick up her daughter from school, her friends and acquaintances immediately became concerned. By evening, her absence was apparent, and the police quickly launched a search. Morgan became the primary suspect. Trying to maintain his story, he claimed he had seen her around noon, but said she had asked him to leave. However, when the police traced her phone's location, they quickly realized he was lying. Under pressure from detectives, Peter tried to explain that he took Georgina's phone to protect her from harmful substances. However, his story was unconvincing, and he was taken to the station for further questioning. After several hours, he broke down and confessed to Georgina's death, claiming that he had been pushed to the edge. He attempted to justify his actions, saying that he had offered her everything, hoping to save their relationship, but was met only with threats and deceit in return. The trial of Peter Morgan became a highly publicized case. Despite his confession, he later tried to argue for a reduced sentence, citing mental health issues and emotional distress in an effort to downgrade the charge to manslaughter. However, the evidence, including his own confession and the surveillance footage, was overwhelming. In the end, Peter Morgan was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after a minimum of 25 years. And this is where I want to pause and speak directly to you all. This story is more than just a crime report or a detective narrative. It's a tragedy that reveals the truth about human vulnerability and obsession. Peter Morgan, a man who sought love and acceptance, confused attachment with ownership. He believed that money could buy a relationship, but in the end, he became a victim of his own delusion. Georgina, driven by her ambitions and the desire for a better future for her daughter, couldn't find a way to stop, and was caught up in a game that ended in disaster. Perhaps the most tragic figure here is little Emily. Losing both her mother and father, she became a victim of adult games where there was no room for concern about her future. Remember, even in the most dramatic and difficult situations, there is always a way out if you acknowledge your mistakes in time and avoid building your happiness on lies and control. Story 2. Have you ever wondered how life can turn into a nightmare in an instant? One decision, one collision, and everything you knew and loved disappears. I'm going to tell you a story that started out as an ordinary day, but ended in a way that no one could have predicted. Imagine this. The doorbell rings at 3 in the morning. You go up, expecting to see a neighbor, or maybe a courier who got the wrong address. But in front of you is the man you thought was out of your life forever. His eyes are full of rage. His hands are clenched into fists, and you feel the air in the room suddenly become heavy. What do? Scream? Run? Or will you freeze, realizing that this is your last mistake? That's how this story began for Alina Shackett. One day, she decided that love shouldn't hurt. She put it all behind her. But he came back. And what happened next came as a shock not only to her, but to everyone who knew her. Alina Shackett was born in Russia in 1997, and at the age of 7 moved with her family to the United States, in the state of Pennsylvania. From childhood, she was an inquisitive and active child, quickly mastered English and became interested in art and science. At school, she was considered a talented and purposeful girl who always went to her goals. She was characterized by kindness and responsiveness, often helped her classmates and participated in charity events. After graduating from high school, Alina entered the University of Pittsburgh, where she studied biology. Her dream of becoming a doctor inspired her to work hard and study. Alina was popular among students, and many friends described her as a sunny person, always ready to support and give advice. Her kindness and desire for justice made her stand out among her peers. Her family, especially her parents Ellie and Ian, were Alina's pride and support. As an only child, she was the center of life for them. Their bond was strong, and they often spent time together, traveling and supporting her in any endeavor. October 2017 brought anxiety to the Shackett family that they could never have imagined. Ellie and Ian, the parents of 20-year-old Alina, had grown accustomed to her constant calls and texts. Their daughter was always in touch, especially at times when they had plans in common. But on this day, the silence that surrounded their home took on a new, frightening hue. Alina had simply disappeared from sight. Even from the morning before, they were to be united by an important event, the charity marathon they participated in every year. The breast cancer campaign was close to their hearts, and Alina always found herself at the center of these events. Her concern for people was sincere and deep. It was as if she drew strength from supporting others, doing so as if she were trying to protect her family from the threats of the outside world. That morning, however, she didn't show up. There were no messages or missed calls. Every minute felt like endless torture. Ellie scrolled through her phone constantly, unable to shake the growing anxiety that spread through her body. Jan, sitting behind the wheel, tried to remain calm, but his fixed stare and trembling hands betrayed his rising panic. The car felt like it was moving at a snail's pace. They were heading to the University of Pittsburgh campus, where Alina rented an apartment. What should have been a 30-minute drive stretched into long hours of waiting for something unimaginably terrible. Ellie rushed to the house, not even glancing back at her husband and their dog, who quietly remained in the car. Her heart pounded in her chest as if it was trying to break free. Her hands shook as she hurriedly pressed the doorbell. The few seconds of waiting felt like an eternity. The silence inside the house was so intense that it felt like the walls were closing in. Ellie and Jan stood on the doorstep of their daughter's home, where instead of the familiar warmth and sounds of life, there was only the chilling emptiness of unanswered questions. It seemed like the entire world around them had frozen in anticipation of something dreadful, as though even the air had grown heavier. Ellie pulled out her phone once again to call Alina one last time. The long rings echoed in her heart, each one cutting deeper like broken threads of hope. No one could have guessed that a morning, which started so ordinarily, would turn into the worst nightmare for the Shackett family. Just half an hour earlier, Ellie had been desperately trying to reach her daughter. Now, she stood at Alina's locked door. Her fists pounded on the wood, the dull sound reverberating through the house, but in return, there was only silence. She called her daughter's name again, her voice trembling and breaking into a shout, but no response came. In that moment, something inside her shattered. Panicking, realizing the situation had spiraled out of control, Ellie screamed for Jan. He burst into the house, driven by a fear that gave him the strength to act. He knew time was slipping away, each second an agonizing stretch of empty moments. With every blow to the door, the sense of impending doom grew stronger. Finally, the door gave way, opening with a sharp sound that granted access to a scene neither of them was prepared to face. Zach, Alina's neighbor, had been watching from the staircase. He suddenly felt like an outsider in this unfolding tragedy. His instinctive step back was nothing more than an attempt to shield himself from the horror that was now spilling out from the still room as soon as the door swung open. Ellie and Jan were confronted with a silence that could no longer hide what had happened. The room was covered in dark stains, like a scene pulled from a nightmare. The floor and walls bore the marks of something unspeakable, as if the light itself had been swallowed by the darkness. Alina's face was unrecognizable, a horrific sight that, at first glance, didn't allow them to realize they were looking at their own daughter. Ellie screamed, her voice cutting through the silence and reverberating throughout the house, making the walls tremble. Jan stood beside her, frozen in place, unable to process the horror in front of him. At that moment, the world seemed to come to a standstill, and nothing could bring it back to normal. The dog, sensing the panic of its owners, began barking uncontrollably, adding to the chaos that had overtaken the house. It seemed as though the entire place was swallowed by an impenetrable darkness. Ellie kept screaming while Jan finally stepped forward, but his legs were shaking. He didn't know what to do. No one knew how to deal with the terror that had invaded their home. Zach, hearing the screams, mustered up the courage to approach the room. He froze at the doorway, hesitating to enter, but already understanding that what had happened would change this family's life forever. In front of him, lying on the floor, was Alina. Her body was sprawled out, as if she had fought to the very end to defend herself, struggling for her life. Half of her face was completely disfigured, as if something or someone had taken not only her life but her identity. In shock, Zach grabbed his phone and called for emergency services. His fingers were trembling, as if the air itself had become thick and heavy. Soon, the sound of sirens pierced the stillness of the Saturday morning. The wail of sirens, growing louder in the distance, filled the now empty streets, shattering the false calm of the neighborhood. The ambulance screeched to a halt in front of the house, and the paramedics, serious and focused, quickly made their way to the door. Their footsteps echoed through the unfamiliar and cold home, where every second felt hostile. Ellie, still standing frozen at the door, greeted the paramedics with a look on her face that told them everything. They knew instantly that this woman would never be the same. Her hands shook so much that she could barely point them toward the room. Jan, still silent and overwhelmed, stood by the door, watching as they passed. The paramedics entered the dimly lit room. The curtains barely let any light through, only intensifying the grim scene. They knelt down beside Alina's body. Everything happened quickly, almost mechanically, checking for a pulse, exchanging glances. It all took just a few seconds, but for Jan and Ellie, time seemed to slow down. One of the paramedics shook his head, and in that moment, their world collapsed. Ellie broke down. She fell to her knees and screamed, as if trying to turn back time, trying to bring her daughter back. Jan, nearly paralyzed by shock, did the only thing he could. He embraced his wife, trying to hold her to the ground, even though he himself no longer felt solid footing beneath him. The paramedics remained in the room for a little longer, preparing to move to the next step, officially declaring the death. But for Ellie and Jan, that news felt like a sentence, a blow from which they could never recover. Outside, red and blue police lights filled the street, catching the attention of neighbors. A crowd began to gather, some whispering, some glancing around nervously, and others pulling out their phones to record the scene. Curious onlookers stared at Alina Chiquette's house, where barricades and patrol cars had already been set up. Officers, their faces stern, were establishing barriers, slowly cutting the crime scene off from the rest of the city, as if trying to shield the world from the grim reality lurking behind the doors of that house. Police Chief Scott Schubert personally led the investigation. He, along with a team of detectives, meticulously examined the scene, photographing every corner of the room. A shattered mirror, an overturned table, and items scattered chaotically across the floor, all pointed to a desperate struggle. According to the medical examiner's report, Alina's death was caused by multiple blows from a blunt object. This wasn't a quiet crime of passion. It was a brutal, calculated act of aggression, where every detail screamed of violence, fear, and despair. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, the chatter growing louder, with rumors spreading rapidly. Some had heard about her boyfriend. Others knew that their relationship had been turbulent, but no one could have predicted that it would end so tragically. The usual calm of this suburban neighborhood had been shattered by a crime that would soon dominate conversations across the town. The police already had one key suspect in mind, Alina's ex-boyfriend, Matthew Darby. A young and promising basketball player, Matthew was known not only for his performances on the university court, but also for his popularity with women. He was always surrounded by people, considered charismatic, confident, and successful. But behind that polished exterior lurked darker, destructive emotions, especially when it came to Alina. Their relationship, which had started at a university in Greensburg, quickly turned into a passionate romance. But passion soon gave way to jealousy and control. Things started to change after she transferred to another campus. Alina tried to focus on her studies, start fresh, and distance herself from the toxic attachment. She broke off the relationship, but Matthew couldn't handle it. All his confidence crumbled when Alina left his life, and that transformed his anger into something uncontrollable. He started following her, calling constantly, and eventually crossed the line. On September 20th, 2017, Alina, with trembling hands, filed a police report. Matthew had broken into her home, climbing through a second-story window, like a scene out of a horror movie. She had heard someone scaling the drainpipe, but even in her worst nightmares, she couldn't have imagined it was him. He burst into her room, fury in his eyes, accusing her of betrayal, ignoring his calls and abandoning him. His hands gripped her shoulders roughly, shoving her onto the bed, squeezing her wrists so tightly that bruises lingered for days. She filed the report, feeling both terrified and relieved, believing that justice was on her side and that she could finally stop him. Jan and Ellie accompanied her to court. The restraining order against Matthew felt like a step toward peace, but that calm was all too brief. In the courtroom, Jan and Ellie held her hands tightly as the judge ordered his arrest. He was detained for unlawful entry, and Alina's family hoped that this would mark the end of the nightmare that had haunted their daughter in recent months. However, their hopes soon crumbled. Darby was released on bail for $10,000, a small sum in the legal system that left Alina to face her fears alone. Jan and Ellie didn't know that this moment would be the harbinger of disaster. Just a few days later, the home where they had tried to find peace turned into the scene of a tragedy. The heavy sense of dread that had been hanging in the air all this time materialized in the worst way possible. Every step the investigators took that day was filled with the realization that important moments had been missed, that the protection Alina should have received had failed. Ellie, standing behind the police tape, was no longer crying. Her face was frozen in a mask of shock and disbelief. Jan stood next to her, holding her hand. Matthew Darby never truly left Alina's world. His shadow seemed to follow her, overshadowing every step she took. Alina's neighbor, Zach, later admitted that he often saw Darby lingering outside her house. He was like part of the place, Zach recalled, realizing too late that he had been witnessing the tragedy unfold without understanding it. He had seen Darby standing in the shadows for hours, silently watching through the windows, as if stalking Alina, never letting her out of his sight. She tried to break free from him, changing passwords and blocking his number, but he always found a way to invade her life again. Matthew's jealousy was insatiable, like a wild animal tearing apart anything that didn't submit to his will. Zach once witnessed a scene late at night when Darby was shouting at Alina right outside her windows. His voice was filled with rage, with a crazed jealousy. It was as if every confrontation was premeditated, and with each attack, he grew more intense. A month before the tragedy struck, Darby had taken control of Alina's online world, hacking her accounts and deleting likes she had given to other men. To him, even the virtual world had to belong to him alone. Alina tried to put up boundaries between herself and Matthew, but it wasn't enough. On the night of September 20th, no one knew what was happening behind closed doors. Zach heard a strange sound, like something had broken. He didn't think much of it. Things break all the time in old houses, but soon after there was a crashing sound, followed by a scream. It was a scream that pierced the quiet of the night, filled with terror and hopelessness. Zach didn't know what to do. He sent a message to the house's group chat, hoping for some kind of reaction, but there was nothing. Time seemed to stand still. It wasn't until later that Zach would learn that by that point, Matthew Darby had already broken into the house and begun his attack on Alina. While the neighbors slept, police were reviewing Alina's phone records, which had gone missing from her apartment after the crime. According to the data, she had been calling for help between 4:15 and 4:55 a.m., desperately trying to save herself. The last call was made from Darby's number, and Alina's phone was tracked to Route A76 near the town of Irwin. It was a final cry for help that went unanswered. A taxi driver, who became part of this grim case, gave his statement to police. He said he had driven Darby to the intersection of Seal Street and Ward Street in Oakland around 4:21 a.m. Darby asked him to wait a couple of minutes, but that soon stretched to 10 minutes, and then another 10. The driver began to feel uneasy, and this sense of dread didn't leave him. Eventually, he left without his passenger. Something felt terribly wrong. Meanwhile, the police continued to examine surveillance footage. They found footage from a camera near Alina's home, showing a figure resembling Matthew Darby, slowly walking down the street, carrying large black bags. He glanced around cautiously, like a predator searching for a place to hide his tracks. The camera captured the moment he stopped at a manhole cover. Darby lifted the lid and carefully lowered the bags inside, as if trying to dispose of not just evidence, but a part of himself, his guilt and cruelty. Detective Edward Fair, leading the case, immediately dispatched his team to the location. The forensic investigators couldn't afford to make any mistakes. They carefully lifted the manhole cover and found 2 knives and a hammer inside, all stained with dried blood. On the hammer, there were strands of hair and pieces of skin. This discovery left a lasting mark on everyone involved in the investigation, a silent testament to the wild and merciless aggression. Now, everything hinged on the forensic analysis. The identification of the evidence would confirm the worst. Each new fact was another blow to the system that should have protected Alina, but failed her. Matthew Darby had vanished, seemingly disappearing into thin air, leaving only a trail of pain and horror behind. The police knew they had little time to catch him, but they had gathered enough evidence to act. The evidence collected at the crime scene was irrefutable: surveillance footage, traces at the scene, and the items discarded in the manhole. Everything pointed to Darby as the guilty party. An arrest warrant was signed immediately, but by the time the police launched their full search, Darby had already fled Pennsylvania, disappearing into the vast expanse of the United States. The hunt for Darby turned into a nationwide manhunt. The search was carried out with relentless determination, but with each hour that passed, the sense of urgency grew. Finally, after several days, Darby's luck ran out in the small town of Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. A passerby noticed a suspicious man attempting to break into a house through a window and immediately called the police. Officers quickly arrived on the scene and found a man whose appearance matched the description provided by witnesses. Darby tried to run, his panic evident in every movement, but the officers were faster. After being apprehended, he presented fake identification, only making his situation worse. His attempt to disguise himself as a fugitive failed, and his identity was confirmed through surveillance footage and witness testimonies. Darby's situation became even more complicated when he was charged with providing false information to the police, adding another charge in South Carolina. Despite his efforts to convince the judge of his innocence, his request for bail was denied. The judge ruled to keep him in custody, fearing he might attempt to flee again, and his extradition request was postponed for further legal consultations with his attorney. While Darby remained in custody, another drama was unfolding in Pennsylvania, one centered on the memory of Alina and the pain of her loved ones. A protest took place in Pittsburgh, organized by Alina's friends and classmates. Hundreds of people gathered outside the courthouse to support her parents and raise awareness about a problem that had been ignored for too long. People held signs with bold letters that read, "Love shouldn't kill," and "Say no to domestic aggression." Many attendees wore purple shirts, the color symbolizing the fight against domestic abuse, with the words, "Our Russian Princess," printed on the back, a nickname Alina's friends had given her. This was a gesture of unity and pain, expressing the anger they felt toward a system that had failed to protect their friend. In addition to the protest, Alina's family, along with activists, pushed for the passage of a new bill, Alina's Law, which would mandate electronic monitoring for domestic abusers. This was their way not only to honor their daughter's memory, but to try and prevent similar tragedies in the future. The bill, which had already been introduced for consideration, became a symbol of hope that no one else would have to face such a brutal reality. At this time, in the courtroom, prosecutors were presenting more detailed evidence, each piece pointing to the premeditation behind Darby's actions. One of the key pieces of evidence was footage from security cameras at Duquesne University, recorded the night before the crime. The video clearly showed Darby walking around campus, nervously glancing over his shoulder. A police officer who was patrolling that night recalled that Darby seemed agitated, possibly even slightly intoxicated. He attempted to enter the student union building under the pretense of needing to charge his phone, but something about his behavior raised red flags. Darby kept looking around, as if afraid someone was following him, which left the officer with a strong sense that Darby was hiding something. Every new piece of evidence, every moment captured on video, brought the court closer to an inevitable conclusion. Matthew Darby, a name that had become synonymous with pain, injustice, and the fight for truth. The moment a photo of him in the campus elevator, wearing a striped shirt with a beer logo, was shown in court, his fate was almost sealed. It was the same shirt found with him at the time of his arrest. The prosecutors left little room for doubt. Darby left the university campus around 4 a.m., called a taxi, and headed to the area where Alina lived. Everything fit together: the late-night break-in, the chilling signs of a struggle, and the evidence left at the crime scene. But the defense didn't back down. Darby's lawyer, David Shree, tried to discredit each piece of evidence. He argued that the security camera footage couldn't definitively identify Darby, and that someone else could have used his account to call the taxi. Could this offer the slightest chance of an acquittal? Unlikely. Soon after, Darby was caught in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, attempting to break into someone's home. He was using fake identification, which only strengthened the case against him and made his flight even more apparent. Despite all of this, Darby chose to keep fighting. A year after the conviction, he returned to court with a new lawyer. Now represented by Joseph Haddock, Darby argued that he hadn't received proper legal counsel during his previous trial. Haddock claimed that Darby wasn't fully informed of the potential risks and outcomes of the trial. This was a fresh attempt to challenge the conviction, based on the argument that attorney missteps had deprived Darby of a fair trial. The Allegheny District Attorney's Office responded to Darby's appeal immediately. Prosecutors firmly stated that all of Darby's rights had been fully respected. However, despite this, the case could still be reopened for a new hearing. In the courtroom, a debate began over the rule of coordinating jurisdiction. Essentially, the principle that judges from one district shouldn't overturn the decisions of another without solid grounds. This procedure could slow down the process, but would not stop it entirely. Darby continued to fight for his release, even though his life sentence already seemed inevitable. His lawyer worked tirelessly, preparing new evidence and searching for any loophole to challenge the conviction. Every attempt was seen as another lifeline for Darby, and he clung to each one like a drowning man grasping at straws. You're probably waiting for the resolution, aren't you? But here's the thing: this story isn't over yet. Matthew Darby was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice appeared to have been served, but this was just the beginning of a new chapter. He filed an appeal, claiming that his most recent lawyer hadn't done everything possible to defend him. Now, years after the original sentence, Darby is once again fighting for his freedom. His legal team is grasping at any possible opportunity to challenge the case. Alina, whose life was tragically cut short, left behind more than just memories. She became an inspiration for change, for a fight to improve a system that had left women vulnerable for far too long. Her family and friends have done everything in their power to ensure that her death wasn't in vain. I want to take a moment to address you, every one of you listening to this story. How can we prevent such tragedies in the future? How can we make sure that no other family endures what Alina's parents went through? We cannot remain silent. Domestic aggression is a reality faced by thousands of women worldwide. It's a problem that must be addressed at every level, from family awareness to legislative action. It's crucial for all of us to understand that love should never hurt, and care should never turn into control. Let's stand together to support those in need. We can make this world safer if we act collectively. And though Alina is no longer with us, her light continues to shine through the people she inspired. Story 3. The Acaia house in Besiktas stood out from the rest, exuding an air of elegance and meticulously maintained grounds. It was a symbol of the success that Halil Acaia had worked tirelessly to achieve over the years. Tall gates, a wide driveway, and an expensive car, all of this signaled the wealth of its owners. Yet behind those gates lay not only money, but also carefully concealed tensions. Halil was 42 years old, and his story was one of perseverance and hard work. Born in a small town in southeastern Turkey, he helped his father run a family-owned auto repair shop from a young age. Despite his modest beginnings, Halil always dreamed of something bigger. After serving in the military, he moved to Istanbul, where he started working as a mechanic. Gradually, he earned the trust of clients and eventually opened his own repair shop. His business thrived, expanding into a successful chain of auto repair centers. Halil became known as a self-made man, but with his success came new ambitions. Elif, his wife, was 7 years younger. As a child, she had dreams of becoming an actress, but reality had different plans for her. Growing up in a wealthy family, she was raised to maintain a perfect image and eventually moved to Istanbul to pursue a career in marketing. It was at a corporate event where she met Halil. She was drawn to his confidence and strength while he was captivated by her poise. To those around them, they seemed like the perfect couple. He, a successful businessman, and she, his graceful and elegant wife. Elif quickly adapted to high society, but her heart remained distant, and their marriage was more of a formal arrangement. At first glance, their marriage appeared ideal. They attended social events together, generously donated to charitable causes, and maintained the image of a successful couple. But behind closed doors, Elif felt that their relationship was more of a partnership than a marriage. They spent their time in different parts of the house and rarely spoke unless necessary. Halil was consumed by his work, while Elif focused on maintaining their public image, managing the household, and handling external family affairs. A few months ago, Elif decided they needed a housekeeper. She justified it by saying she was too busy organizing charity events, but in reality, she was simply tired of handling the mundane chores. Through acquaintances, she found Ice, a young woman from a rural area who had come to Istanbul in search of work. At 24, Ice seemed like the perfect candidate to Elif. Pleasant, modest, and hardworking, Ice quickly adapted to the rhythms of the Akaya household. Ice was born in a small village in the eastern part of the country. She came to Istanbul with high hopes, determined to earn enough money to support her parents. Landing a job with Halil and Elif felt like a stroke of luck. Good pay and stability allowed her to plan for the future. Ice kept a low profile and didn't get involved in her employer's affairs. Her role was limited to cleaning, cooking, and keeping the house in order. She tried to avoid drawing attention to herself, but that wasn't always possible. Halil began to show interest in Ice from the very first day she started working. He didn't make overt comments or express any dissatisfaction, but the way he watched her and his presence around where she worked spoke volumes. Elif either didn't notice or pretended not to, absorbed in her social commitments. Ice did her best to steer clear of any interaction with Halil, but the tension in the house was becoming more palpable. Soon, Ice started noticing that Halil seemed to be looking for excuses to talk to her. He would show up in the kitchen while she was cooking, asking odd questions about her life and future plans. She responded briefly and tried to finish her work quickly, but she could feel the pressure building. The attention from her employer was unsettling, yet she didn't know how to react, fearing she might lose her job. Elif remained unaware of everything happening in the house during her absence. To her, Halil was predictable and reliable. She trusted him because their marriage was always built on mutual agreements where every word and action had its place. But within this stable world, an invisible crack was beginning to form. The household continued its usual routine. Elif was busy planning events, meeting with friends, and Halil was spending more time at work. Ice came and went according to her schedule, doing her duties as expected of a housekeeper. But there was a growing disruption in this routine. Halil was staying home more often on the days Elif was out for meetings. His attention became intrusive, his behavior persistent, but he carefully kept this from his wife. Neither Elif nor Halil anticipated that their comfortable lives were about to change. Ice kept fulfilling her responsibilities, trying to stay out of sight whenever Halil was around. She noticed that lately he was around far too often, as if deliberately finding reasons to engage with her or be in the same room. Her instincts told her it was best to keep her distance, but she couldn't afford to quit the job that had become her only stable source of income. She sent money back home to her family in the village and didn't want to worry them with her own troubles. Despite her employer's unsettling behavior, Ice kept coming to work, but it was becoming harder for her to hide her anxiety. One evening, while she was preparing dinner, Halil unexpectedly walked into the kitchen and stood uncomfortably close. She caught a whiff of his cologne and a chill ran down her spine. He asked if she needed any help, but there was an edge to his voice that made the question sound more threatening than kind. Ice answered briefly and quickly slipped away to another room, doing her best to avoid eye contact. Elif didn't notice any of this. She was too caught up in her own affairs to pay attention to such small details. Ice didn't dare to share how she felt, sensing that her place in the house was becoming more and more uncomfortable. She thought about leaving, but she was afraid of losing her job and not being able to support her parents. The fear of Halil held her back, and every time he appeared out of nowhere, her hands would start to tremble. A few days went by and the tension was reaching its peak. Ice became more cautious. She avoided long conversations with Halil, quickly left the room when he got too close, and made sure not to stay at the house longer than necessary. But one day, when Elif was out for the entire day, Halil stayed home. He hadn't given any notice, and when Ice arrived in the morning, he was already waiting for her in the living room. She tried to keep her composure and went about her usual tasks, but his presence felt like a heavy, invisible weight on her shoulders. Halil began questioning her, asking increasingly personal questions. He wanted to know who she talked to, who her friends were, and where she went after work. Ice responded in short, vague answers, but his persistence scared her. At one point, he moved in too close and grabbed her hand, causing her to freeze. She managed to pull away, excusing herself by saying she had to get back to work, and hurried off to the kitchen, her heart pounding with fear. These encounters were happening more frequently, and Ice started seriously considering quitting, but she didn't know how to bring it up with Elif. She was afraid that if she left, Halil might find a way to harm her. One evening, after a particularly difficult day, she called her mother and couldn't hold back her tears. But even then, she didn't dare to tell her what was really going on. The fear of the consequences was too overwhelming. The night when things finally reached a breaking point started off like any other. Elif was out at another meeting, and Halil stayed home. Ice was getting ready to finish her work and leave when Halil suddenly appeared at the kitchen doorway, blocking her exit. He spoke calmly, but his words had a menacing undertone. She felt cornered, and when he tried to step closer, she shouted something out of sheer panic, without even thinking. It worked. Halil stepped back, but the look in his eyes made it clear that this wasn't over. The next day, Ice didn't show up for work. Elif was surprised, but thought maybe the young woman was sick and hadn't had a chance to inform her. Another day passed, and Ice was still absent. When Elif asked Halil if he had seen her, he seemed calm, almost indifferent. He briefly replied that Ice had probably found another job or returned home. But days continued to pass, and there was still no word from Ice. She wasn't answering calls or messages, and her phone was turned off. Elif began to worry, but her attempts to reach out through mutual contacts led nowhere. When she finally decided to call Ice's parents, they were frightened and just as confused. They too had lost contact with their daughter and couldn't understand where she could have gone. Ice's disappearance caught everyone off guard. She wasn't the type of person to vanish without a word, and this made Elif even more anxious. A week went by, and still, there was no sign of Ice. Elif reached out to a friend of Ice's who occasionally helped around the house, hoping to get some information. But the friend also had no idea where Ice could be, saying they hadn't seen each other in a while. Elif felt that something was off but wasn't sure what to do next. The situation became more pressing when Ice's parents called her, pleading to find out if there had been any issues at work that might have caused their daughter to disappear. Elif found herself in an uncomfortable position, promising them that she would let them know immediately if she learned anything. Meanwhile, Elif's suspicions about Halil started to grow. She couldn't help but notice how he had reacted to Ice's disappearance, too calmly without a hint of concern. Elif began to recall how he had started staying home more often and showing an unusual interest in ice, though at the time she hadn't paid it much attention. Now her mind was filled with unsettling thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something, but having suspicions was one thing. Finding actual proof was another. All she could do was wait. While Elif struggled to figure out how to get in touch with ice, the young woman's parents decided to contact the authorities. In the initial stage, investigators interviewed acquaintances and relatives, but it didn't lead to any breakthroughs. They reached out to Elif, who told them everything she knew. How Ice had been a reliable worker. There were no issues, but she hadn't shown up for several days, and no one had been able to locate her. The police began their investigation, but without any signs of aggression or indications that Ice had been taken against her will, the case was moving slowly. Things took a turn when a neighbor mentioned seeing Halil's car parked near the house late at night before Ice disappeared, even though he usually didn't come home that late. This statement was the first small clue, but it didn't yet paint a clear picture. Elif felt increasingly confused and wasn't sure if she should trust her own suspicions. One evening, while Elif was sitting in the living room nervously fiddling with her phone, Halil approached her and suggested they talk. He brought up the rumors surrounding Ice's disappearance, saying that they could damage their reputation, especially his business, and that she needed to stop worrying about it. Elif wanted to ask him directly what he knew about it, but she couldn't find the courage. Halil had a way of pressuring people, and his calm, confident manner often stifled any resistance. She felt a growing fear that if she started asking too many questions, it could lead to unwanted consequences. She nodded and said she would try not to think about it, but inside, her anxiety continued to build. Meanwhile, the investigation continued. Detectives started reviewing surveillance footage from around the Kaya home and along the route Ice usually took. One of the cameras captured her on the day she was last seen leaving work. She was walking along the sidewalk as she always did, but what happened after that was still a mystery. Cameras at Halil and Elif's house also recorded her leaving that evening, but there were no other suspicious details. Elif began questioning herself. Why was Halil so calm about her disappearance? What was he hiding, and had he tried to cover his tracks? As all this was unfolding, Elif tried to distract herself with her usual activities, but the thoughts of the missing young woman haunted her. One day after returning home from a meeting, she noticed something odd in the garage. Normally, everything was neat and tidy, but this time some things had been moved around, as if someone had been searching for or trying to hide something. She felt an urge to take a closer look, but Halil appeared so suddenly that she jumped. He asked what she was doing there, and his expression seemed harsher than usual. Elif mumbled that she just wanted to check if everything was in order, but Halil didn't break eye contact. Then, in a calm tone, he told her it was best not to get involved in his affairs, and that there was nothing of interest in the garage. It was a small moment, but it made Elif think. She knew that everything in their home was supposed to be under Halil's control, but why did he seem so tense when he saw her in the garage? Something didn't sit right with her, but without any proof, she couldn't accuse him of anything. Over the next few days, she paid even closer attention to his behavior, trying to catch the slightest hint of dishonesty. But Halil remained calm and confident as usual. Ice's disappearance became a topic in the local news, and reporters began digging for information. They discovered that Ice couldn't have just left without saying goodbye to her family or taking her belongings from the apartment she rented. The police continued their questioning, focusing more and more on those who had been the last to see her. They returned to Elif and Halil, this time with more specific questions. Elif answered honestly, but when it was Halil's turn, he once again maintained his calm, composed demeanor. However, beneath his calm exterior, there were signs of growing tension. He realized that the police were digging deeper than he had anticipated, and it was starting to unsettle him. One day, Elif overheard him on the phone, catching a few phrases that sounded strange, but she couldn't make sense of them. He told someone that everything would be taken care of, and that there was no need to worry. Elif tried not to read too much into it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping past her. When the police arrived with a search warrant, Elif realized their lives would never be the same. She stood at the doorway, watching as investigators checked every corner, trying to find anything that might hint at the reason behind Acey's disappearance. Then they approached the garage, pausing for a moment. Halil, who was standing nearby, suddenly tensed up, and Alif noticed it right away. When they opened the garage door, no one expected to see anything out of the ordinary. It was just a place for the car and a few tools. But when one of the investigators noticed a large wooden crate in the corner and asked to have it opened, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. Alif froze, her heart pounding so loudly that it felt like everyone around could hear it. Halil took a step forward, but before he could say anything, the investigator signaled to open the crate. As the investigator opened the wooden crate, everyone stood still, bracing for what might be inside. Halil clenched his fists, trying to maintain his composure, but his face had gone slightly pale. Alif, unable to contain her curiosity and fear, stepped closer, trying to see what was inside. The process of opening the crate took only a few seconds, but it felt like time had come to a halt. When the lid of the crate was opened, all it contained were some old tools covered in a layer of dust. There was a mix of disappointment and relief in the air. The investigators moved on to other parts of the garage, and Halil acted as if he found the whole thing amusing. But Alif noticed how tightly his fingers gripped the phone in his pocket. Her suspicions grew stronger with every passing moment. The search lasted for several hours, but nothing was found that could explain Ace's disappearance. The officers left one by one, and Alif felt a strange sense of relief, as if something important had just been averted, yet not entirely resolved. Halil seemed to regain his confidence and suggested to his wife that they should forget about it, dismissing the whole thing as a misunderstanding. But Alif couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something hidden in that house, something she didn't know about. After the search, Halil began to act differently. He became more secretive, often leaving without explaining where he was going, and returning late at night. This wasn't like him, and Alif started to fear for her own safety. She knew her husband was someone who liked to control everything around him, and if he was hiding something, he would do whatever it took to make sure the truth didn't come out. Meanwhile, the investigation into Ace's disappearance continued. The police explored every possible angle, from abduction to a voluntary disappearance. They interviewed neighbors, Halil's colleagues, Alif's friends, but nothing concrete surfaced. Still, the investigators had a feeling that this case was more complicated than it seemed. The disappearance of a young woman, who had suddenly gone off the grid, remained their primary focus, and their suspicions were only growing. One day, after returning home from a business lunch, Alif found that Halil was gone, and his phone was lying on the kitchen counter, which was unusual for him. She was about to head upstairs when she noticed the garage keys left next to the phone. Her heart began to race again, but this time, she couldn't resist the urge to check the garage once more. She quietly stepped outside, trying not to make any noise. The garage looked just as it had before, neat, well-maintained, with a few tools and old items stacked in the corner. But this time, something caught her eye that she hadn't noticed earlier. A small stain on the floor, which looked like traces of paint or dirt. She didn't think much of it at first, until she realized the stains led toward the back wall of the garage. How had the investigators missed these odd marks during their search? Alif moved closer, her breathing quickening. Behind the wall was another section, cluttered with junk, which she hadn't known existed. It was a small room, locked with a padlock that looked new. She recalled fragments of conversations she had overheard when Halil thought she wasn't around, and everything began to fall into place. She knew she couldn't leave without finding out what was behind that door. Using the keys she had found, Alif managed to unlock the padlock and carefully push the door open. She only cracked it open a bit, but what she saw inside was enough to send a chill through her entire body. The room was small and narrow, lit only by a faint light coming through a crack in the ceiling. On the floor were plastic bags, and the walls were covered with old newspapers, giving the place a dark, eerie feel. It was silent and cold inside, as if the space had been long forgotten. Her eyes landed on one of the bags, and Alif felt her breath catch in her throat. She stepped back, almost stumbling, and hurried out of the garage, closing the door behind her. She didn't know what to do next, but she understood she had to act quickly. She needed to reach out to someone she could trust and explain the situation, but every time she tried to dial a number, her fingers trembled, and her mind raced with the thought that Halil could come back at any moment. Meanwhile, Halil returned home later than usual, and Elif pretended that nothing had happened. But the next day, she went straight to the police and reported what she had seen. It was her only chance to get to the bottom of things and protect herself. Investigators immediately responded to her statement and returned with a search warrant, this time granting them permission to thoroughly inspect all areas, including the hidden room in the garage. When they opened the door, everything that had been concealed was laid bare. Inside, they found plastic bags containing Ace's belongings, including her personal documents and phone. But the most alarming discovery was the traces of blood among her things, which suggested she had been there and that something terrible had occurred. The room, which Halil had clearly tried to keep hidden, became the key to solving the mystery, and the police began piecing everything together. Halil didn't come home that evening. He had disappeared as soon as he learned that Elif had shared her findings with the authorities. Knowing he had nothing left to lose, he attempted to flee, but the police had already set up surveillance at all possible exits from the city. When his car was found on a side street on the outskirts, he did not resist and quietly surrendered to the law. Once Halil was in custody, investigators began a thorough examination of his connection to Ace's disappearance. Interrogations went on for hours, and at first Halil remained calm and composed, but slowly, signs of fatigue and frustration began to show. The investigators deliberately pressured him, asking why he had been acting so strangely in recent weeks, what had really happened between him and Ice, and what was hidden in that small room in the garage. Halil continued to deny any involvement in her disappearance, insisting that he had no idea where she was, and that he would never harm her. But the investigators were persistent. They laid out everything they had found in the garage: Ace's belongings, her documents, her phone, and the traces of blood on the floor and walls, which had been washed but still contained small, incriminating spots. It all pointed to one thing, that something terrible had happened in the garage, and Halil had tried to cover it up. After several hours of questioning, Halil finally broke down. He realized that denying the obvious was futile. He sighed heavily, looking more exhausted than he had in a long time. Speaking quietly, he confessed that on the night before Ace disappeared, they had been alone in the house. Elif was out at a meeting, and he had taken the opportunity to try once more to get closer to Ace. She rejected him, saying she would not tolerate his advances, and warning that if he didn't stop, she would tell his wife and the police. His expression darkened as he recounted how, in a fit of rage, he grabbed Ace, trying to make her be quiet. She managed to break free and quickly began gathering her things, leaving the house and heading toward her own place. The words came out slowly, as if he was reliving each moment with disgust. When investigators began closely reviewing footage from the security cameras that showed Ace leaving the Akaya home for the last time, they initially assumed she had indeed left and was heading home. However, after further investigation and analysis of other camera recordings, the police discovered that Halil had used a clever trick to hide the truth. That evening, Ace did leave the house, but she was walking into a trap. The cameras captured her walking down the street, but then she disappeared from view. At this point, the investigators noticed that just a few minutes after she had left, Halil drove out of the house in his car. At first, this seemed like a mere coincidence, but then they noticed something strange. His car stopped in a dark, secluded corner of the neighborhood, outside the range of most cameras. It was there that Halil waited for Ace. He had arranged beforehand to give her a ride home, convincing her that he wanted to apologize for his behavior and have a talk. Ace didn't expect anything bad to happen and got into the car, thinking a short ride wouldn't cause her any harm. But Halil deviated from the usual route and took her back to the house through a rear entrance, which was not covered by security cameras. This entrance was rarely used and hidden from the neighbor's view. Once they were inside through the back door, Halil committed his crime. First, he assaulted Ace. Then he struck her head against the wall with such force that she passed away instantly. He knew that the cameras at the front entrance had recorded her leaving, which he hoped would serve as an alibi if anyone started asking questions. He planned for the police and others to believe that Ice had left the house and disappeared somewhere on her way home, and his car movements could be explained as unrelated errands. After Halil ended Ice's life, he placed her body in a plastic bag and carefully moved it to the garage, where he had already prepared a hidden spot. He intended to hide the body and come up with a story to cover his actions. However, late that night, he took the body out of the garage and transported it to an abandoned warehouse, hiding it in an old container, hoping that this location would remain unnoticed. During the interrogation, Halil refused to admit the truth for a long time, but under pressure from investigators, he finally confessed how meticulously he had planned everything to mislead the police and cover his tracks. He believed his plan would work and that no one would connect Ace's disappearance to him, but he underestimated how thoroughly the police would analyze his driving routes and match them to the timeline of her disappearance. Ice's body was found in a terrible state. It was clear that Halil had tried to erase all evidence, but the clues gathered from the scene in the garage confirmed his guilt. The medical examiners carefully inspected Ace's body, uncovering multiple injuries, with a severe blow to the back of the head identified as the fatal one. However, the bruises and abrasions all over her body indicated that it wasn't just a single strike, but a prolonged assault. Further examination revealed other troubling signs. DNA analysis showed traces of Halil on Ace's body, serving as indirect evidence that she had been subjected to aggression before her death. The test results left no doubt. The biological samples found belonged to him. Interrogations dragged on for several days. Halil repeatedly insisted that he hadn't wanted things to get out of hand and that everything he did was an attempt to protect his reputation. He tried to convince the investigators that he acted in a moment of extreme emotion, but they could see that his actions after the incident were calculated and deliberate. He meticulously planned how to hide the body, cleaned up evidence, and tried to cover his tracks. This wasn't a desperate act. It was a carefully orchestrated crime aimed at avoiding exposure. In court, Halil appeared calm and composed, but every gesture and word came across as the defense of a man who had nothing left to lose. He tried to elicit sympathy, claiming that the situation spiraled out of control and that he acted out of fear, but no one believed him. His attempts to paint himself as a victim of his own emotions were shattered by the relentless facts that were revealed one by one. The prosecutor laid out all the evidence against him. Surveillance footage, witness statements from neighbors, blood traces, and Ace's belongings that he hadn't managed to destroy. Elif was present in court, but her face was unreadable. She stood among the crowd, listening to the testimonies, realizing her life had collapsed. She tried to justify herself by thinking she couldn't have known her husband was capable of this. But deep down she felt guilty for missing the warning signs, for allowing Halil to act freely while she was occupied with her social life. She knew that after all of this, she would have to learn how to live again, but she also understood that the life she had built with Halil was gone forever. The court sentenced Halil to life in prison. All his attempts to seek a lighter sentence were unsuccessful. His confession, along with the gathered evidence, left no room for acquittal. He sat in the defendant's cage, listening to the verdict with a stoic expression, but as he was led out of the courtroom, his face showed nothing but despair. He understood that he had lost everything forever, his freedom, his business, his reputation, and the life he had spent years building. Ace's story was not forgotten, and her name remained in the memory of everyone who followed the case. She became a victim, not only of Halil's reckless desire and rage, but also of how easily she could have been forgotten until she disappeared. For her family, it was a shock that would never fade. They had found justice, but the loss would stay with them forever. Elif, trying to find a new purpose, left Istanbul. She moved to another city and began working with organizations that focused on protecting women's rights. Yet, despite her external efforts to change her life, her internal wounds still bled. She knew she would never escape the questions of whether she could have prevented all of this if she had noticed earlier. The house in Besiktas stood empty and was eventually sold. Its walls, which once masked the illusion of a happy and successful life, now stood vacant like a ghost of the past, reminding everyone that nothing is ever quite as it seems. Story 4. Sometimes reality turns out to be more chilling than any horror movie, and this story is a perfect example of that. Imagine this, a luxurious home, a perfect couple. He's a successful businessman. She's a charming and confident woman. A glamorous life, full of wealth and style. But here's the twist. Behind that shiny facade were secrets dark enough to send a shiver down your spine. I want to tell you about Mike and Susan Reschel, a couple everyone saw as the epitome of success, but only they knew the dark secrets hidden behind the walls of their home. No one could have imagined that one cold February night, everything would end in tragedy. A call to emergency services and accusations that would make your skin crawl. You know what they say, the devil is in the details, and the story proves it, because it was the little things, texts, casual words, red droplets on the floor, that came together to paint a picture you just can't look away from. Millionaire Mike Reschel and his wife Susan were often seen out together, dining at high-end restaurants and vacationing at luxury resorts, projecting the image of a flawless married life. Their mansion in the upscale neighborhood of Naplesville, Florida, sparkled just as brightly as their idealized union. A well-maintained garden, a shimmering pool, sleek modern interiors. It seemed like everything Mike touched turned to gold, and Susan, his trophy, was no exception. But behind those walls were deep cracks, ones that even the most skilled designer couldn't conceal. Mike's success in business had made his name known in certain circles, but his personal life remained shrouded in mystery. Rarely did anyone hear about his past, a past that led back to his days as a young student at the University of Florida, where he met his first love, Dee Hoffman. At 19, he was already building ambitious plans and climbing the career ladder, and their youthful romance turned into a marriage that lasted a quarter of a century. Dee spoke of him as a kind and reliable man, one who never raised a hand or even his voice. But a thriving career had its cost. Mike became a workaholic, spending months away on business trips, leaving his family in the shadow of his job. This eventually led to their quiet divorce in 2005. Dee moved on, but the echoes of the past did not. Soon, Susan stepped into her place. A young nurse Mike met through an online dating site. She was 38, and she caught his attention from the very first messages. Her energy, charisma, and zest for life were magnetic, and without hesitation, he invited her into his world. Before long, Susan had moved in and taken the place that once belonged to Dee. In August 2007, they got married, and from that moment, the mansion, once filled with memories of Mike's first family, became the home of a new union. However, on February 3, 2018, before dawn, the calm of this new life was shattered. A call to emergency services broke the silence, and Mike's shaky voice reported a break-in. An unknown intruder, masked and armed with a knife, had attacked him and his wife. Police and paramedics arrived quickly, but what they found exceeded even their darkest expectations. The yard was eerily quiet, as if watching everything unfold, and the mansion's massive windows reflected the flashing lights of the sirens, casting sinister shadows across the glass. From the outside, everything seemed perfect, but those who knew them closely noticed that not everything was as smooth as it appeared in this marriage. Susan ran their household with a firm hand, influencing many aspects of Mike's life, and she wasn't shy about showing her dominant nature. She had previously worked in a hospice, caring for patients with serious illnesses, but after getting married, she left that job to focus on domestic responsibilities and her new social status. Although Mike stopped traveling for business and bought a dental clinic to be closer to Susan, the tension in their home grew with each passing year. Beneath the facade of wealth and success was a very different reality. Mike would tell his friends that he had found in Susan someone with whom he could build a new life, but his hesitant attempts to strengthen their bond were often met with a cold, distant attitude. And now, as the police officers walked through the mansion's hallways, taking note of details that had previously gone unnoticed, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Details suggesting that things had been hidden within these walls, things Mike had never openly spoken about. Everyone was waiting for answers. Who was the masked man? what had brought him to this home, and most importantly, what was really hidden behind the facade of a peaceful and prosperous marriage. But before diving deeper into those terrifying events, let's take a step back and look at this couple's past. By 2015, the relationship between Mike and Susan was no longer as perfect as it seemed to the outside world. The primary cause of their growing tension was the complicated dynamic between Susan and Mike's daughters, especially his eldest, Caroline. Susan didn't hide her dislike for Caroline, and in moments of anger, she would sometimes send Mike sharp, angry texts about his daughter. She believed Mike was giving Caroline too much time and attention. In turn, Caroline didn't have any warm feelings toward her father's new wife either, accusing her of trying to push her out of Mike's life. Caroline mentioned that Susan often had a habit of drinking a bit too much. 5 or 6 glasses of wine or martinis in an evening were not unusual for her. Yet she managed to keep her composure and engage in conversation, even when she had a few too many. By the fall of 2017, tension in the family had reached a breaking point. Everything escalated when Caroline started planning her wedding. Mike wanted to make sure her big day was perfect, so he allocated $100,000 for the event. It was a substantial amount, but Susan reluctantly agreed to let him cover the expenses. However, the cost of the wedding kept rising, and by the time everything was set, the final budget had ballooned to over $250,000, which infuriated Susan. Despite attempts to find common ground, especially during the wedding preparations, Susan remained upset when she found out just how much Mike had spent on the celebration. 3 weeks after the wedding, which took place in November 2017, Mike opened up to Caroline, revealing that Susan had physically confronted him several times. His daughter immediately believed him, as she had noticed a faint white scar on his cheek on the day of the wedding. Mike even showed her photos of injuries he had taken after one of the incidents. It turned out that Susan had once attacked him with a knife, leading to her arrest. But was this the only incident? What was really going on behind closed doors in that house? When Susan found out the true cost of Caroline's wedding, she was furious. She lashed out at Mike, threw a phone at him, and began to hit him. The incident was shocking to everyone who thought they knew this couple. Surprisingly, after attacking her husband, Susan was the one who called the police. This decision seems strange, given that she had always tried to maintain control over the situation. Perhaps she planned to present her version of events first and avoid any charges. But things didn't go as she had intended. When the police arrived at the Roychell residence, they found clear signs of a recent altercation. A broken phone on the floor, overturned furniture, and a tense atmosphere between the couple. Officers conducted a brief conversation with both Mike and Susan. Susan was emotional, giving a disjointed account of what had happened, while Mike appeared visibly distressed. The officers decided that the best course of action was for Susan to leave the house for a while to calm down and reflect on her actions. She agreed, but only verbally. The officers left, assuming the issue was temporarily resolved. Half an hour passed, yet Susan had not left the house. She remained inside, trying to convince Mike to stay together and work through their problems. The sound of water and the soft glow of candles in the cozy restaurant created the illusion of a calm evening. But the atmosphere at Mike and Susan Roychell's table was anything but peaceful. That morning, things had seemed different. Mike hoped this dinner would be the start of a truce, a chance to return to the days when everything between them was simple. But instead of a warm smile, Susan's face had a hardened expression, and their conversation quickly shifted to familiar, tense topics. She had once been the person who made his life brighter, and now she was his main source of anxiety and conflict. Misunderstanding and frustration simmered between them, like water in a kettle ready to boil over. Now, let me walk you through the events of that day in detail. The dinner ended as abruptly as it began. Mike stood up, tossed some cash on the table, and left. Susan sat there, staring blankly, as if trying to process all the words that had been said. They had argued once again about Caroline, Mike's eldest daughter from his first marriage. Susan could never forgive him for the $250,000 he had spent on Caroline's wedding, seeing it not only as extravagant but also as a betrayal. In her eyes, the more he invested in Caroline, the more distant he became from her. She had always fought for influence, for the feeling of being the most important person in his life, and this struggle was slowly destroying their marriage. As Mike walked out of the restaurant, Susan was left deep in thought. She wasn't sure what to do next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't about to lose control of the situation. A few minutes later, she stood up, grabbed her phone, and sent him a message. "Good luck with your daughter. I'm filing for divorce." It wasn't a threat, but a statement of her intentions. Then, realizing that their conversation was far from over, she sent another text. "You have serious issues with your daughter. I will not tolerate this behavior." In that moment, she made up her mind. Susan hailed a cab and headed home. The house was quiet. The large windows allowed the soft moonlight to spill in, casting long shadows across the hallways. Susan entered the guest room unaware that this evening would bring a test she would remember for the rest of her life. The clock struck midnight when the door suddenly opened, and Mike appeared in the doorway. There was something wild in his eyes, something that made Susan tense up. They started arguing again, and it quickly escalated into a full-blown confrontation. But this time, it went further than ever before. Mike's anger broke through, and soon, they were struggling against each other. Susan felt a sharp pain pierce her abdomen. Horrified, she realized that Mike was holding a knife, and she desperately tried to break free. Everything happened so fast. She didn't have time to understand how a heated argument had turned into a nightmare within seconds. Blood slowly trickled down her arm as he struck her again. This was no accident, this was intentional. But there was one thing Mike didn't expect. She wasn't going to give up. He tried to restrain her, but Susan's determination to survive made him hesitate. She realized that if she couldn't convince him to stop, she might not see the morning. "Fine, I won't file for divorce. I won't leave you," she whispered through the pain, desperately hoping those words would make him stop. Mike froze and something changed in his eyes. Maybe he finally realized what he had done. In a panic, he began putting the knife away, grabbing his things, and quickly came up with a different version of events. "It was a stranger. We'll say it was someone in a mask, and everything will be fine. You're gonna say what I tell you to." "Got it," Susan agreed. She had nothing left to lose, but the moment she was brought to the hospital and felt a sense of safety, she immediately told her side of the story. The next few hours were a blur. Police calls, urgent announcements over the intercom, tense conversations in the hospital hallways. Susan opened up to doctors, investigators, anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, Mike was trying to convince everyone of his version, insisting that they had been victims of a late-night intruder. He even deleted the footage from the security cameras, trying to erase any trace of what had really happened behind the walls of their home. When officers returned to the Roychell residence, they were surprised to find no signs of a break-in. The windows were intact. The locks were untouched. It didn't take long for them to realize that Mike's story didn't add up, but he had a backup plan and quickly put it into action. He carefully tried to persuade the police that the doors had been left unlocked, suggesting that someone might have entered while they were asleep. His performance was so convincing that, for a moment, it seemed plausible that this could have been a random incident. Then the investigators received footage from the restaurant security cameras, and the pieces started to fall into place. They saw Mike and Susan leaving separately, not speaking to each other, and later entering the house and going to different rooms. It was clear these scenes had nothing to do with a supposed nighttime intruder. It all seemed odd, implausible, and suspicions began to grow. As investigators tried to piece everything together, they began to realize that this was just the tip of the iceberg. The story Mike had tried to frame as an attack was much darker and more complicated than anyone could have imagined. Mike continued to push his version of events, but the cracks in his story were starting to show. The shadows in the house, which appeared calm on the cameras, were hiding events that no one expected to uncover, and they became the starting point for a new, far more chilling twist in this tale. When Mike Reschel was arrested, the first thing he did was dial his daughter's number. His voice was shaky, but determined, as if he could dispel all doubts with sheer force of will. "Caroline, I didn't do anything," he repeated, his tone insistent. "You have to call my lawyer. You have to get me out of here. He knew that without her support, his chances of freedom were slim. Caroline wasn't just his daughter. She was his steadfast ally, the one person who could defend his reputation in court and in the eyes of the public. But everything that had happened over the last few weeks didn't align with the image of the successful and composed businessman that Mike was known to be in certain circles. News of his arrest spread like wildfire, touching not only his family, but also friends, colleagues, his ex-wife Dee Dee, and anyone who had ever crossed paths with Mike. The shock was palpable. Dee Dee, who had spent 25 years married to him, seemed devastated. Mike was a kind, gentle man. I can't believe he could do something like this. Friends described him as rational, calm, always steady, even in moments of crisis. Yet something had happened to this paragon of success and stability that seemed almost inconceivable. The prosecutor, however, had a different perspective. From their side, the narrative was about a man who was used to being in complete control of his life, suddenly losing that control. Mike couldn't handle the idea of a divorce, of losing the assets he had worked so hard to accumulate over the years. This blow hit him hard, and it drove him to make a reckless decision. The prosecution's version was straightforward. Mike feared that after the divorce, Susan would take half of his fortune, and that threat pushed him to try to solve the problem once and for all. Now, it was up to his attorneys to prove that Mike was not involved in the attack, that the story of the intruder was real, and that Susan's injuries were the result of a tragic accident, not an intentional act. At the first court hearing in mid-February, Mike publicly shared his version of the events for the first time. His account sounded sincere, but unconvincing. He confirmed that on the night of February 2nd, he and Susan had indeed argued at the restaurant, and each returned home separately, heading to their own rooms. It was a chilly evening, and after his anger had cooled down, Mike decided to go to the guest room to try to have a conversation and make amends. He wanted to reconcile, but when he entered, he was met with a disturbing sight. Susan was kneeling by the bed, holding a knife. He claimed that she looked desperate, and he feared she was going to harm herself. Mike recounted that he tried to persuade Susan to put down the knife, but she refused. A struggle began, not a violent one, but more desperate and awkward, like two people tangled up in their own emotions. At one point, as Mike described it, he felt the cold blade graze her abdomen. He was also cut when the knife slipped from her hand. Susan was breathing heavily, and blood slowly soaked through her clothes. He claimed it was an accident, that he was only trying to stop her, but there was one major inconsistency. That same evening, when the couple supposedly decided to cover up the incident with a story about an intruder, Mike said they sat on the bed, talking about the future, as if trying to forget about their injuries. We were discussing our travel plans, vacations, life. It was one of the best conversations we'd had in a long time, he recalled with a nearly nostalgic smile. But who could talk about a bright future while seriously wounded? To those listening, it sounded absurd. Meanwhile, the trial and investigation were gradually uncovering new details. The police report mentioned bloodstains not only on the bed, but also on the walls, the floor, even the mirror in the bathroom. But there was another troubling detail. The bed was not only stained with blood, but also had traces of vomit and feces, and the room had a suffocating, oppressive smell. Mike couldn't explain how this happened, and their version of events provided no answers. All of this deepened the suspicion that the incident was far darker than anyone could have imagined. In court, Mike also mentioned another strange moment. When their dog jumped on the bed, it distracted him, and Susan managed to grab the knife again and cut her wrists. She was crying, whispering that she was terrified of going to jail, that she was scared, and didn't know how to handle it. Mike knew that the police would find the surveillance footage, and according to him, he realized he had to act. He claimed he turned off all the cameras to avoid accusations. Then, a few minutes later, he decided to call emergency services, spinning the story of a nighttime intruder. But a story built on lies began to crumble under the weight of its own inconsistencies. When investigators reviewed the surveillance footage and conducted searches, it became clear that no one had broken into the house. Mike had meticulously deleted parts of the recordings, but not all of them. Fragmented clips showed there was tension between Mike and Susan long before that night. The medical experts confirmed that Susan's injuries were inflicted with intent, not by accident. The knife wounds were precise, not random, but the signs of struggle that Mike tried to hide told a different story. He claimed he was only trying to protect her, but as the court hearings began, the facts painted a darker, more sinister picture. The story of a masked intruder seemed to be nothing more than a cover for something much more troubling, and it appeared that Mike was not prepared for that facade to start crumbling. The questioning in the courtroom was intense, the atmosphere electric, as if a spark could ignite at any moment and change the course of the entire case. Mike's lawyers attempted to build a defense based on the image of a man cornered in a toxic relationship. In their version, Susan was not just a wife but a tormentor, threatening his peace and safety. They reminded the court of her prior arrest for aggressive behavior, presenting it as evidence of her tendency towards hostility, and pointed confidently to the threatening and accusatory messages found on Mike's phone from Susan. But their most powerful move was bringing up Mike's posts on online forums, where he sought support from other men who had experienced domestic struggles. There, he described his life as a constant battle, looking for empathy and understanding. These posts were filled with desperation, complaints about constant accusations of infidelity despite a lack of evidence, and Susan's demands that he cut ties with his daughter, which only heightened the tension. The defense tried to convince the court that Mike was trapped in an unstable, destructive marriage, and his claim that Susan had turned the knife on herself seemed plausible. At first glance, this narrative was convincing. Susan's messages did indicate instability. In some of them, she expressed thoughts of self-harm, writing that she didn't know how to go on, that her life had lost meaning. Mike's attorneys used this to argue that she might have staged the attack to provoke a conflict and make Mike suffer. But Susan's legal team was not about to back down. She denied all accusations of aggressive behavior and posed sharp, direct questions. If Mike was truly a victim, why did he never go to the police? Why did he stay in the relationship and keep up the facade of a happy marriage? Their defense was built on a simple yet powerful argument. If Mike was genuinely afraid of Susan, why didn't he leave? Why did he stay? And most importantly, why did he fabricate the story of an intruder on the night of the incident? It was up to the court to figure out who was telling the truth, and with each session, the case grew more complex and entangled. Realizing that an emotional defense alone would not be enough, Mike's attorneys decided to strengthen their case by bringing in a forensic expert. This specialist examined the evidence at the scene, focusing particularly on the blood spatter analysis found in the guest room. He stated that the pattern and direction of the blood indicated that Susan's injuries were inflicted late at night, closer to 3 a.m., which supported Mike's version of events. Susan, however, insisted that the attack happened around midnight while she was sleeping in her room, and that her husband was the one who attacked her first. This argument became a pivotal point in the trial. Medical experts testified that with such severe cuts to the wrist, a person could bleed out within an hour without proper medical attention. But Susan survived, and Mike's lawyers argued this backed up his claim that the injuries were inflicted shortly before the paramedics arrived. However, the situation took a turn when the credibility of the forensic expert was called into question. It soon emerged that his reputation was far from spotless. His license had previously been suspended due to breaches of professional ethics, and his name had been linked to a grim scandal. This revelation was like a lightning bolt in the courtroom. Susan's defense team presented documents revealing that the expert had been involved in a horrifying incident. He had been caught stealing organs from the deceased, with police discovering a collection of organs, including hearts and brains, in his personal refrigerator. These shocking details undermined the credibility of his findings in Mike's case. Suddenly, the expert's conclusions weren't just questionable. They threatened to dismantle Mike's entire defense strategy. Susan and her lawyers seized on this, arguing that the blood spatter on the walls and furniture pointed to deliberate knife strikes, not accidental self-inflicted injuries. They contended that Mike had been restraining Susan during the attack, preventing her from moving or defending herself. In court, Susan demonstrated how she claimed Mike placed the knife in her hand to create the illusion that she had harmed herself, then inflicted wounds on himself to make his story more believable. But soon, even darker aspects of this story began to emerge. During the investigation, evidence was found showing that Mike had long lost interest in marriage. Despite his claims of trying to work things out, he was actively pursuing a life without Susan. Proof of his registration on multiple dating sites dealt a new blow to his defense. It turned out that Mike was seeking connections with younger women and openly discussing future plans that didn't include his current wife. Susan's legal team seized on this fact, arguing that Mike had been dishonest about his intentions all along. They suggested that the attack might have been premeditated, part of a plan to get rid of his wife without losing money in a divorce. The defense argued that all his actions, from attempting to erase surveillance footage to calling the police with a story about a burglar, were designed to create an alibi and avoid financial consequences. Mike struggled to maintain control of the situation, but each new detail revealed how his grip was slipping as his web of lies grew thicker. Initially, Mike and Susan's story seemed like just another domestic dispute, but it quickly unraveled into a deep tragedy where everyone was entangled in their own deceptions. Prosecutors, defense attorneys, witnesses, they all had their own perspectives, but each new day in court revealed more secrets, exposing a much darker truth behind the facade of a happy life. What began as an ordinary dinner spiraled into one of the most sensational trials in recent years. Mike Reschel, a man known to many as a successful and composed businessman, found himself at the center of a high-profile scandal, accused of attempting to take the life of his own wife. It seemed to start with a simple disagreement. Susan wanted a divorce, and Mike didn't want to lose money or control. But how did it all escalate into a nighttime nightmare filled with blood, knives, and deceit? The jurors sat with stony expressions, listening intently to the testimonies of lawyers, experts, and the accused themselves. Every word was weighed carefully. Every glance and gesture could be interpreted in different ways. But when it came time to deliver the verdict, it took them only 4 hours to decide Mike's fate. 63 years old, a successful businessman, a man who was used to keeping everything under control and now guilty. Attempted manslaughter, evidence tampering, denial of medical assistance to the victim, and witness intimidation. The court showed no leniency when it handed down the sentence in December 2019. 30 years in prison. That was the end. Or at least it seemed like the end. Mike wasn't ready to give up. He tried to appeal the verdict, but the court denied his appeal. Now, he sits in a correctional facility somewhere in Florida, with almost no chance of early release. But even that didn't stop the interest in the case. After his arrest, rumors began circulating that Mike, while in custody, was trying to find someone who would take care of Susan. Allegedly, he was plotting to get rid of her even after he was locked up. These rumors stirred the public and pushed the police to open a new investigation. However, there wasn't enough evidence to bring new charges, and Mike avoided additional sentencing. But his name became even more tarnished, and the story even darker. As for Susan, she tried to return to a normal life after all the horror. She filed for divorce as soon as Mike was arrested, and pushed for the process to be as quick as possible. Unlike her husband, she avoided the spotlight. No interviews, no public statements. She just wanted to move on. But there was still one issue. Their house, the home that once symbolized their love, but later turned into a scene of nightmares, now became the setting for a new legal battle. Susan was determined to claim her share. She insisted that she had every right to a portion of Mike's assets, despite all his efforts to leave her with nothing. The irony was that this luxurious mansion, which once seemed like a fortress for their marriage, had turned into nothing more than a battleground. Lawyers on both sides were maneuvering against each other, making strategic moves trying to claim victory. Even from behind bars, Mike, through his attorneys, did everything he could to strip Susan of her rights to the joint property. For Susan, the house wasn't just about money. It was about closing the door on her past. She didn't want to remember how her blood had stained those polished floors, how she had sat there, clutching her abdomen, begging Mike to call for help. Her fight for the house was more than just a legal dispute. It was a fight for freedom from the ghosts of her past. Is this a happy ending for Susan? Hardly. She won in court, but she lost so much more, her life would never be the same. What started as an attempt to have a peaceful conversation over dinner led to a bloody conclusion, and 30 years behind bars for her husband. And Mike, a man who was used to luxury, attention, and controlling his fate, now spends his days and nights in a solitary cell, with no expensive suits, no fast cars, and none of the people who once admired him. So what do we see here? It's not just about money, status, or control. It's a story of how unresolved conflicts, hidden resentments, and a thirst for power can tear even the strongest apart. We all know that every lie, every deception, comes with a price, and Mike paid with his freedom while Susan paid with her peace of mind. Think about it. What would you have done if you were in their place? Who's the real villain here, and who's the victim? The answers lie somewhere in between, and perhaps they will never be fully clear. Story 5. Imagine living your whole life thinking you know everything about those closest to you, only to find out they've been hiding a chilling secret for 25 years. Family secrets can shape our lives in ways we don't even realize, and sometimes they hold us back from finding true happiness. When the truth finally comes to light, it can feel like your whole world is collapsing in an instant. Personally, I believe that trusting someone's words after so many years is a risky gamble. It's hard to imagine living side by side with someone, knowing their dark secrets and staying silent. But were there personal motives at play here? Let's dive in and uncover the truth together. Today we'll explore a spine-chilling story of love, betrayal, and a tangled mystery involving unsolved crimes that shook the peaceful town of Holland, Michigan, to its core. The incidents were so shocking that every resident had their own theories about what could have happened. It took investigators many years to finally bring the suspect to trial, but was the right person held accountable? Gail Wingarden was born on April 24, 1965, to Wendell and Dorothy Wingarden as the 8th child in a large and close-knit family. She grew up in Ottawa County, Michigan. Although the family wasn't wealthy, they were known for their strong bonds and the care they showed each other. They truly embodied the meaning of a loving and united family. Despite their warm household, financial difficulties were common, and from a young age, Gail dreamed of a career that would allow her to afford the things every child wishes for. She saved up money and shared with her older sister Cheryl that she planned to work hard, so she'd always have enough to buy anything she wanted. As a teenager, Gail landed her first job as a waitress. Although the pay wasn't much, she made good money through tips and worked tirelessly. Her charming, friendly, and warm nature meant she never left anyone in her circle indifferent. At 18, Gail experienced her first true love. The relationship moved fast. The young couple moved in together, dreaming of having their own home and starting a family. They lived together for about a year. In 1984, when Gail was 19, she started a new job where she met a 25-year-old contractor named Rick Brink. It was love at first sight. Gail ended her previous relationship and threw herself completely into her new romance. Rick was so captivated by her that on the very first day they met, he told his mom he had found the woman he wanted to marry. He was head over heels, and their relationship blossomed with beautiful dates and romantic outings. Rick went out of his way to make Gail happy, fulfilling her every wish, and the two of them were deeply in love, feeling absolutely fulfilled together. They were truly a perfect match, both hardworking, ambitious, and full of energy. They shared the same dreams for the future, wanting to work hard and eventually raise a family in the home they hoped to buy. One summer, they visited Rick's family lake house at Lake Michigan, where he had a boat. Gail tried water skiing, and everyone who knew them said they looked like the perfect couple. On April 25, 1986, just one day before Gail's birthday, they got married in a small church ceremony surrounded by family and friends. They had a long and happy life ahead of them. Rick's father, Garrett Brink, helped them find the perfect home they had been dreaming of. It was an old house sitting on about 20 acres of land on their hometown, Holland, Michigan, on Ransom Street. Garrett secured a great deal, and the newlyweds were eager to start renovating so they could move in. Rick, being a skilled handyman, worked for a furniture company and trained carpenters. which meant he was well prepared to take on the renovation of their home. By October 1987, they moved into their partially renovated house, documenting their progress on video. The once-old home was getting a new life as they cleaned, painted, tore down walls, and repaired the floors. At the time they moved in, they had been married for about 18 months. Gail confided in her sister that the next room to be renovated would be a nursery because they were ready to take the next step in their life, filling their home with children. On November 21, 1987, Rick and Gail attended the wedding of one of Rick's high school friends and had a great time. But the following day, neither of them showed up for work. At the time, Rick worked for a major furniture company called Trenway. He was known for being hardworking and reliable, so it was completely out of character for him not to show up for work without notifying anyone. Rick's supervisor tried calling his home, but there was no answer. Concerned, he then reached out to Rick's parents, asking if they knew why he hadn't come to work. The supervisor was genuinely worried for his employees' well-being. Rick's parents were equally alarmed. They knew their son and understood that disappearing without a word was not something he would ever do. They decided to contact Gail's workplace to check on her, only to learn that she too had not shown up that morning. Anxious and worried, Rick's parents rushed to their son and daughter-in-law's home to see what was going on. When they arrived at Rick and Gail's house, they immediately noticed Rick's car parked in the driveway. Feeling relieved, they hoped the couple was home, perhaps just feeling unwell or sleeping in. But as they approached the vehicle, they saw Rick inside in an unusual position. He was sitting on the driver's side, with his knees on the floor beneath the steering wheel, his body hunched over and leaning toward the passenger seat, his head resting against the passenger side door. Rick's father, Garrett, got closer and called out his son's name, but there was no response. When Garrett reached in and tapped his shoulder, he found Rick unresponsive, and he noticed blood coming from Rick's head. Horrified, Rick's parents did not enter the house. Fearing what else they might find, they immediately contacted the Ottawa County Sheriff's Department. When the deputies arrived, they went inside the house. Upon inspection, they found Gail in the bedroom. At first glance, it looked as though she was simply sleeping, with a pillow covering her face. But when the officers lifted the pillow, they discovered it was stained with blood, and Gail was no longer alive. She had been shot 3 times at close range. Within minutes, backup arrived, and investigators began examining the home, searching for any clues or evidence that could lead to the perpetrator. They carefully combed through the scene, trying to piece together what had happened. The initial theory from the officers was that this might have been a planned act against Gail, and that afterward Rick, in a state of distress, harmed himself. However, when they thoroughly searched Rick's car, they found no weapon, no evidence to suggest that he was responsible for the attack on his wife before taking his own life. In an instant, the fairy tale romance that had begun at work and led to dreams of a happy family life came to a tragic and violent end, leaving behind no clear motive or suspect. The investigation continued. The weapon used in the crime was identified as a .22 caliber revolver. It was later confirmed that Rick had suffered a fatal injury from a gunshot to the head. He was shot twice, both at close range. Investigators noted a bullet hole in the passenger side window of Rick's car. The window was shattered and the driver's side window was partially rolled down, leading authorities to believe that the perpetrator was someone the victims knew. Based on this, they theorized that Rick had rolled down the window to speak with the person, suggesting he likely knew them and did not sense any immediate danger. Additionally, after inspecting the house, it became clear that this was not a robbery. There were no signs of forced entry or a struggle. The door had not been broken into, nothing was ransacked, and all belongings were neatly in place. Rick and Gail's wallets were found on the kitchen table, with cash and credit cards still inside. Some jewelry was scattered throughout the house. The victims were both still wearing their wedding rings, and no weapon, shell casings, or other significant evidence was discovered in the house. The bullets recovered were still inside the victims, indicating that the suspect came with a single intention: to take their lives. As for usable physical evidence, it was either non-existent or insufficient for analysis. 6 fingerprints were found in the house, for belonged to the victims, while the other two could not be matched with any records in law enforcement databases. The forensic examination concluded that Rick and Gail were killed in the early hours of November 22nd. Rumors and speculation surrounded the case, but not everyone who had suspicions was willing to speak openly or inform the authorities. With limited evidence, the investigators couldn't make any arrests or identify any potential suspects. However, it was established that the last sighting of Rick and Gail was around 11 p.m. on November 21st, when they were leaving their friend's wedding reception. According to the autopsy, their deaths occurred sometime between then and the following day, nearly a full day before they were found. Hoping to gather more information about the couple's last known contacts, investigators continued questioning friends, family, co-workers, and anyone else who knew Gail and Rick. The first person they spoke with was Gail's brother, Ryan Wingarden. He mentioned Gail's ex-boyfriend, who had once confronted her in a public place, claiming he still loved her and felt jealous. He had tried to persuade her to come back to him, but Gail was already married and happy. The police tracked down Gail's ex-boyfriend and brought him in for questioning. He denied any involvement and even agreed to take a polygraph test, which he passed. He also had a solid alibi, so the authorities ruled him out as a potential suspect. About 3 or 4 days into the investigation, the police received another lead. The previous owner of Rick and Gail's house came forward to the police station, suggesting that the perpetrator might have been looking for him and wasn't aware that he no longer lived there. The former owner was a biker who went by the name Shotgun and had been affiliated with a motorcycle club. In the past, he had been involved in the trafficking of banned substances and weapons. However, Shotgun eventually became an informant, as he didn't agree with selling banned substances to teenagers. He worked with federal agents, primarily providing information about those who engaged in this kind of illegal activity. The detectives dug deeper into this lead. They interviewed other informants and questioned members of various motorcycle clubs in Detroit. Despite their efforts, they couldn't find any evidence linking these groups to criminal activity or to the double crime involving Gail and Rick. After about a month, this theory was also dismissed. A new lead emerged on Christmas Eve when another crime occurred near the Brinks home. Deborah Wilson was found in her own backyard, the victim of a fatal assault. She had been attacked and sustained a severe injury to her neck. During the investigation, it was discovered that Gail and Deborah had gone to the same high school and were in the same class. They were the same age and had overlapping social circles, raising immediate speculation that the crimes could be connected. The small town's residents were terrified. The community was on high alert as fear spread that a potential suspect was still out there. The senseless nature of the crimes made people worry for their own safety, wondering if there would be more victims. However, as time went on, investigators were unable to find any connection between the two incidents. The case of the double crime involving the young married couple was eventually shelved. All the files and evidence were placed in storage, where they remained for the next 2 decades. Friends and families slowly began to lose hope that justice would ever be served. The families learned to live with the possibility that they might never know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. But after 20 long years of waiting, the truth finally came to light, revealing not only an unexpected suspect, but also dark family secrets. Following the deaths of Rick and Gail Brink, no arrests were made. In 2009, the Ottawa County Sheriffs formed a cold case team to investigate unsolved crimes. By 2011, Detectives Venus Repper and David Blakely reopened the 24-year-old case of the Brink couple. They started reviewing old documents and conducted over 200 interviews. To make progress on these cold cases, the detectives worked together for about 7 to 8 years, developing their own strategy. Their approach relied on the passage of time as an advantage. They operated with a fresh perspective, hoping to catch details that may have been overlooked during the original investigation. Detective Repper explained, loyalties change, friendships change, and people who might have kept a secret back then may no longer feel the need to do so, or they may have held on to it for so long that they just want to let it go. After closing the case involving Deborah Wilson, where the suspect had already passed away, the detectives turned their focus back to Rick and Gail's case. Nearly a year passed before they began interviewing some family members. When they spoke with Gail's sister, Cheryl Murphy, and one of her aunts, they encountered some puzzling information. Both women mentioned that Gail and Cheryl's brother, Ryan Weingarten, had unsettled them over the years with odd remarks. According to the aunt, these comments began as early as the couple's funeral. She recalled Ryan saying to her, "Do you think I could have done it?" She was taken aback and speculated that Gail and Rick might still be alive if it hadn't been for a family argument that took place the night before the tragedy. On November 20th, Gail's aunt received a call from her first. Gail complained about her brother, Ryan, telling her aunt that he owed her money and was not in any hurry to pay it back. Shortly after, Ryan called their aunt as well, venting his frustration about Gail. He was upset, claiming that Gail acted as if she was better than the rest of the family and refused to allow their parents to park their camper on her driveway. Gail's aunt knew that parking the family camper had been a long-standing issue among the Weingartens. Later, the aunt explained that the elder Weingartens had sold their house for some reason and were temporarily living in their camper on Ryan's driveway. However, this arrangement violated county codes, so they couldn't stay there for long. Ryan was trying to find a solution and had discussed the situation with Gail, but she wouldn't let their parents park near her home. This made Ryan very angry. Both the aunt and Cheryl claimed they had heard Ryan say, "Sometimes I wonder if I did it because of that argument," clearly referring to the crime. After speaking with Cheryl and the aunt, the detectives were intrigued but also puzzled. They revisited the case files and found that Ryan and his girlfriend Pam had been questioned at the time of the crime. They claimed they had spent the evening doing laundry, first at a laundromat and then at a friend's house. However, the detectives noticed that this friend had never been contacted to verify their alibi. It was later discovered that a few years after the crime, Ryan and Pam got married and were still together when the investigation was reopened. In October 2012, they were both called in for questioning again, which only added to the mystery. During the first interrogation, Pam admitted that the alibi they provided back in 1987 was false. They had not actually been at the friend's house. Despite this, she insisted she was certain of Ryan's innocence. She was brought in for another interview on January 15, 2013. This time, a personnel specialist was present because Ryan had insisted that Pam not speak to the police without an attorney. Detectives suspected Pam was hiding something, so they went to her workplace 3 days later to ask more questions. This time, Pam declined the presence of a personnel specialist. She started opening up, and the detectives decided to continue the interview at the police station. It was there that Pam finally confessed. Many years ago, Ryan had told her he had been responsible for the deaths of his sister and her husband. A few months later, Pam revealed even more details. She admitted that the day after the crime, but before the bodies were discovered, Ryan took her to the Brinks home. Pam actually saw their bodies covered in blood. She had kept silent for 25 years because she loved him, but also out of fear, as Ryan had repeatedly threatened her, warning that she would face the same fate if she ever spoke up. Pam Weingarten also told investigators that before the bodies were found, Ryan confessed that he had committed the crime because he was jealous of Rick Brink's happiness and success. He was also worried that Gail might reveal a dark family secret, that he and Gail had been involved in a relationship. Based on Pam's testimony, Ryan Weingarten was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, facing trial for the deaths of his sister and her husband. While under oath, he described 3 instances of close contact with his sister Gail when they were teenagers. Regarding the last encounter, he claimed they only touched each other and nothing more. During the trial, Ryan took in his own defense. When the topic of his intimate interactions with Gail came up, he offered an explanation. According to him, they were both just curious about each other and nothing more. He acknowledged that if they had had more time together, they might have explored further, but their mother soon entered the room and nothing else happened. He then claimed that sometime later, they found some marijuana in their father's truck and, while under the influence, began touching each other. He stated that a similar incident happened later, but insisted that it was the last time. He maintained that these incidents were consensual and that he never did anything beyond touching. Ryan's trial began in March 2014, with Pam as the prosecution's key witness. Several other witnesses were also called, including Ryan's aunt and his sister Cheryl, who both recounted the strange comments he had made over the years. Another witness was a friend of Ryan's named Jim Meacham. Jim claimed he often visited Ryan's home in the mornings for coffee, just to sit and chat. Jim testified that on the morning of November 23rd, he dropped by Ryan's house, and Ryan mentioned that his sister and her husband had died. Jim didn't ask questions, assuming it was some kind of routine matter. However, he also noted that Ryan had shared this information several hours before the bodies were officially discovered. The defense attempted to challenge Jim's memory, arguing that his conversation with Ryan might have taken place the day after the bodies were discovered, rather than before. They couldn't state this with absolute certainty, but they felt confident that, given the over 25-year gap since the incident, there was room for doubt. The defense also raised several other key points. They primarily argued that Ryan was innocent, and that the only evidence against him was Pam's testimony, which lacked any substantial physical evidence or supporting proof. On March 28, 2014, the jury found Ryan Wingarden guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Rick and Gail Brink. The deliberation took only 4 hours. After the verdict, his own sister, Cheryl Murphy, said, "We're done. We finally got him." Less than a month later, Judge John Hulsing sentenced Ryan to 2 life terms without the possibility of parole. He stated, "This was a cruel crime. You are a cruel, cold-blooded criminal." Ryan never admitted guilt to the authorities and continued to insist on his innocence until the end. Over the next year, both the prosecution and defense built their arguments around their theories. The defense maintained that it was more likely the crime was a case of mistaken identity aimed at the home's previous owner, rather than Ryan killing his sister and her husband out of jealousy or due to an alleged relationship he wanted to hide. They pointed out that Rick was not Gail's first serious boyfriend or the first man she lived with, and that Ryan had no issues with her previous partners. The defense argued that the theory of the couple being killed to cover up a relationship between siblings was weak. To discredit Pam's testimony, the defense questioned why she had waited so long, over 2 decades, before coming forward with her version of events. To recap, Pam and Ryan met just a few months before the crime. She told investigators and testified in court that right after the crime, Ryan came to her, confessed, and then took her to the crime scene the day before Rick's parents discovered the bodies. He showed her the bodies and threatened to harm her if she ever spoke about it. At that time, Pam was not yet his wife, and they had no children together, but she claimed she knew he had killed his sister, and despite this, continued their relationship, eventually marrying him and having children. I'm in shock, folks. While the defense was correct in pointing out that the motive seemed weak and that there was no forensic evidence, the prosecution countered with several points, even if they weren't direct evidence. First, they highlighted that each victim had been shot in the head and face, which is often indicative of a personal reason behind the crime. Ryan Wingarden was ultimately sentenced to life in prison without parole. In August 2015, Ryan's appeal was reviewed by the court. The defense sought to overturn the conviction or have a new trial. Their main argument was that the only evidence against Ryan was Pam's testimony, and they believed the jury should have seen her police interviews to demonstrate how investigators had allegedly manipulated her. The court, however, disagreed and upheld the conviction. One of the challenges of the case was the time that had passed since the crime, which remained unsolved for too long. There was no weapon recovered, no forensic evidence, and the motive presented by the prosecution seemed speculative. Although motive isn't a legal requirement for a conviction, juries often rely on it when making their decisions. It might have been more convincing to present a plausible motive, like a dispute between Ryan and Gail over their parents or the camper situation. On the other hand, Ryan had no criminal history prior to this crime. Of course, we know that a clean record doesn't necessarily mean innocence. Some people just don't get caught. Furthermore, the only substantial evidence against him was the testimony of others, primarily his wife. The statements from his aunt and sister about Ryan's strange comments over the years might seem suspicious, but they don't constitute hard proof. Could investigators have really manipulated Pam as the defense claimed? While she was able to provide crucial information during her interrogations, it's also possible she was a woman considering divorce and found a way to distance herself from Ryan permanently. This isn't a proven fact, but it does seem risky to sentence someone to life in prison based solely on the words of a person who claims to have feared her husband for 25 years, despite never showing signs of that fear to others. Why didn't Pam go to the police when she wasn't yet married to him and could have ended the relationship more easily? And if she confided in someone else, why didn't anyone else come forward? One of the detectives noted that over time, people's loyalties can shift. Those who once kept dark secrets may years later reconsider their decisions. Perhaps they want to ease their conscience or no longer feel the same attachment to the person they once protected. In my view, this case is too tangled to draw a clear conclusion. Relying solely on Pam's testimony without sufficient evidence raises doubts about the fairness of the conviction. Did the jury make the right decision, or was the prosecution's case built on unproven allegations? What do you think? Was justice served, or is there a possibility of error here? Story 6. Have you ever wondered how, in just a few minutes, an ordinary day could turn into an absolute nightmare? Imagine this. You're on a tropical island, lush with greenery, where the sun gently warms your skin and the sound of the ocean promises peace. But what if, behind every tranquil corner, there's a shadow waiting for just the right moment to make itself known? On April 7, 2019, Miriam Bild, a young tourist from Germany, set out for a walk to a temple on Ko Chang Island. It was supposed to be just another peaceful day of her vacation. But by evening, she hadn't returned. Security cameras captured her smiling and carefree as she headed up the trail. But little did anyone know that in just a few hours, that smile would disappear forever. Ko Chang, known for its soothing, laid-back atmosphere, rarely experiences disturbances. This island breathes with slow-paced natural beauty, turquoise waters, white sand beaches, and deep green jungles that keep secrets centuries old. Into this secluded paradise in spring 2019 came Miriam Bild, a young woman from Germany who decided to combine a business trip with a long-awaited vacation. However, her journey would soon unravel into a disturbing and tangled mystery that still leaves many questions unanswered. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Miriam was driven and successful. In fact, after graduating from the University of Hanover, her career as a design engineer with a large company had been progressing rapidly. She was used to long hours and frequent work trips, but this one felt different. After wrapping up her business obligations, Miriam decided to spend a few days on the isolated island of Ko Chang, finally fulfilling her dream of seeing the white sands and crystal-clear waters she'd heard so much about. But everything changed when Miriam didn't show up for breakfast on the morning she was supposed to leave. Concerned, hotel staff tried to contact her, but her phone was unreachable. Hours passed before her disappearance was reported to local authorities, but no one yet realized the gravity of the situation. According to official records, Miriam had come to Thailand on business, and her meeting with suppliers had gone smoothly. Her colleagues mentioned that she often liked to pair work trips with a bit of personal relaxation, even if that meant staying alone in a foreign country. It may have been this curiosity that prompted her to linger on the island as the rest of her team returned home. Miriam loved exploring the places she visited, yet according to her friends, spontaneous connections or risky adventures had never been part of her plans. Despite this, some locals remembered that Miriam had shown a keen interest in the less-traveled corners of the island. Tour guides mentioned that she asked about hidden beaches and quiet coves, places where one could feel truly isolated from the world. This curiosity seemed a little unusual to those who knew her. She typically preferred to follow a clear plan, making sure every detail was carefully thought out. Miriam wasn't new to travel, and her itinerary had been meticulously arranged. After wrapping up business in Bangkok, she planned a day trip to Pattaya before heading over to Ko Chang. Many tourists make similar short excursions to enjoy the beaches and sights, but for Miriam, it was something different. She sought places that didn't feature in the tourist guides, places where she could be alone with nature and her thoughts. Her journey began with a morning ferry ride that brought her to the island. True to her organized nature, Miriam rented a motorbike right away and set off along a pre-planned route. One of her intended stops was an ancient stone temple perched on a hill, reachable only by the most determined and resilient visitors. This temple was known among locals as a secluded place of reflection, hidden away behind dense foliage. The day started quietly. As she approached the temple, she was greeted by the familiar signs of a tranquil island morning. Her rented motorbike left parked at the base of the hill, and a small flower stall nearby with a vendor arranging fresh jasmine and calendula bouquets. Miriam greeted him, bought a couple of flowers, and then made her way up the stone staircase. Surveillance cameras captured her climbing the steps confidently with a bottle of water and a small backpack. There was a light smile on her face, as if she was eagerly anticipating something meaningful and beautiful. But time passed and she didn't return. By evening, her motorbike still stood parked beside the now closed flower stall, a silent witness to her absence. No one had seen her come back down the steps, and this quickly raised concern among the locals. The flower vendor was the first to notice that something was amiss. Miriam's motorbike was still there, untouched, and she hadn't been seen all day. The next day, he reported it to the authorities, and what started as a simple missing person case soon evolved into something far more unsettling. When investigators began tracing her route, they quickly realized that Miriam would never have stayed on the island for long. She had only planned a single day there, a short excursion, a few photos, lunch, and then a return to the mainland. Organized and cautious, Miriam always followed her own rules. She avoided strangers, kept her valuables close, and regularly checked in with family. So when the messages from her stopped, it was the first red flag for her loved ones. By noon on April 7th, she was no longer responding, and by evening it seemed as though she had simply vanished. The temple on Hilltop, where Miriam was headed, isn't a typical tourist destination. No formal tours go there, and even locals rarely visit. It's surrounded by thick jungle, and the path is long and difficult. The stone steps, damp and covered in moss, make the climb even harder. She was hiking alone, and according to security footage, no one else was nearby at the time. The police reviewed the video recordings multiple times, hoping for any clue, but all they could see was Miriam's ascent toward the temple. Her stride steady, her expression calm, with a light smile on her face. Time seemed frozen in this brief clip, the last known record of her presence on the island. As police began interviewing locals, they uncovered a new lead. A couple of days prior, she had been seen at a cafe near the pier with an unfamiliar man. His identity couldn't be confirmed, but he seemed to know her well enough to sit and chat over coffee. Perhaps they had met on the ferry or at her hotel, but no one else reported seeing them together after that encounter. Miriam's disappearance stirred up a series of haunting questions. What happened on her path to the temple? Why did she never come back down? And who was the stranger she was seen talking to? On the morning of April 8, 2019, Ko Chang Island awoke to a chilling discovery. A Thai tourist out for an early morning hike to the temple, hoping to enjoy the cool air and morning calm, was about to stumble into a nightmare. As he made his way up the steep, stone-covered trail, soaking in the quiet of the jungle, he noticed something unusual near the edge of a small ravine, just off the path. Through the thick foliage, a pale shape caught his eye, a sight strikingly out of place amid the dense green. As he moved closer, it became clear. He had found the body of a young woman. She lay wedged between two large rocks, covered by branches and leaves, as if someone had tried to conceal her. The woman's body bore signs of physical trauma, and bloodstains were visible nearby. Shaken by what he'd found, the tourist immediately called the local emergency services. Within an hour, officers were making their way up the winding path to the scene, and concern quickly spread across the island like wildfire. While police on Ko Chang were trying to understand what they were facing, panic was escalating back in Germany among Miriam Bild's loved ones. She had stopped responding the evening of April 7th, which was highly unusual for her. Known for being responsible and cautious, Miriam always kept in touch, especially when traveling alone in a foreign country. Her parents, used to her regular messages and calls, became increasingly anxious, and by the next morning, after realizing they had heard nothing from her, they filed a missing person report with local authorities. Meanwhile, investigators on the island were starting to piece together the details of this troubling case. The body found in the ravine was identified as Miriam Bild, a 20-year-old tourist from Germany who, according to hotel staff, was supposed to have returned from the island on the evening of April 7th. However, her rented motorbike remained parked at the base of the hill, where she'd left it before setting out for the temple. Initially, authorities considered the possibility that Miriam had suffered a tragic accident, a slip or a loss of balance on the slick trail, but that theory was quickly dismissed. Her injuries were too severe and numerous to be explained by a simple fall. Her face and head bore clear bruises and cuts, and signs of aggression suggested that her death had been both intentional and violent. Additionally, evidence indicated that she had been assaulted before her passing, casting an even darker shadow over the case. The investigation began with a review of surveillance footage from cameras positioned along the trail in the parking area at the hill's base. The footage captured Miriam climbing the steps, holding a bottle of water, and carrying a small backpack. She walked with purpose and appeared calm, but one key detail continued to disturb investigators. Just minutes after she disappeared around a bend, another individual appeared on camera. A man dressed in dark clothing was following her at a distance. When he eventually returned, his clothes appeared dirty and damp, with noticeable light-colored stains. Further investigations began to unravel the events of that day. The flower stall vendor, located at the base of the trail, remembered seeing this man. He had noticed him arrive on a motorbike, purchase a bouquet of marigolds, and then head up the trail after Miriam. It seemed innocent enough, except for the man's odd behavior on his return trip. The vendor recalled that he looked nervous, glancing around repeatedly, and when asked if everything was okay, he brushed it off, claiming he had just slipped. The vendor found his demeanor strange and decided to jot down the motorbike's license plate just in case. Once the police discovered Miriam's body and initial clues began to surface, this mysterious man quickly became the prime suspect. Surveillance footage, the vendor's description, and the recorded license plate led the authorities to identify the bike. It was registered to Ranikorn Ramruin, a 24-year-old local resident. Ranikorn worked as a beach cleaner, maintaining the coastal waters, and lived alone in an old house on the outskirts of the island. Officers immediately headed to his home, but he was nowhere to be found. They began a search, hoping to find something that might shed light on his potential connection to Miriam. At that point, underlying conflicts, previously unnoticed, began to emerge. Ranikorn was known among locals as a reclusive, somewhat eccentric figure, but few were aware of his darker tendencies. Neighbors described him as quiet, yet unwelcoming. He kept to himself and rarely confided in anyone, but those who knew him more closely had seen glimpses of erratic aggression and strange, anxious behavior. Some even claimed they'd spotted him wandering around the island as though searching for something or waiting for someone. So who was this man who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere to disrupt a young tourist's dream of a tropical paradise and turn it into a tragedy? And what drove him to follow Miriam on that day? In the early morning hours of April 7, 2019, Ko Chang was still cloaked in silence when Ranikorn Ramruin awoke in his small home on the island's edge. The night had provided little relief. His mind was still reeling from lingering thoughts and visions, fueled by a haze of prohibited substances. His house was thick with the scent of cheap alcohol, empty bottles scattered across the table. Ranikorn knew he needed an escape from this state, something to distract him, even for a moment, so he wouldn't spiral further. A few beers and some shots of stronger alcohol became his usual ritual, a temporary escape that helped him numb his thoughts, even if just for a few hours. But on that day, his usual routine wasn't enough. After the effects of the controlled substances kicked in, he found himself craving something more, and he took an additional dose of a different substance, which quickly pushed him into an altered state. His thoughts began to pulse erratically, lacking any coherence, while a sense of agitation and excitement roiled within him. Needing an outlet, he decided to ride his motorbike somewhere, anywhere, to escape his inner chaos. Riding along the road, he eventually found himself at the base of the hill where a trail led up to one of the island's temples. It was there that he first spotted her, a young European tourist, neatly dressed, with a light, carefree stride and a relaxed expression, was making her way up the stone steps, completely unaware of the eyes watching her. The sight of this graceful, carefree young woman pulled Ranicorn out of his fogged state. He couldn't look away, and giving in to his clouded impulses, he decided to follow her. At that moment, Ranicorn stepped into a nearby stall and purchased a bouquet of marigolds, hoping this gesture would give him a friendly appearance and allow him to approach the young woman. The vendor noticed him and was struck by the man's unusual behavior. His eyes appeared empty, yet somehow filled with a strange intensity. This made the vendor uneasy, but Ranicorn didn't linger long. He soon set off up the trail after Miriam, disappearing around the bend. Meanwhile, Miriam, unaware of the shadow following her, continued her climb to the temple at a leisurely pace. She was enjoying the cool morning air and the view from the trail. For her, it was just another day in a long-awaited vacation, a brief escape after countless days of hard work. She was a seasoned traveler and knew how to keep herself safe, but even her caution couldn't have anticipated what would happen next. Surveillance footage captured Ranicorn catching up to her, holding the bouquet. At first, he tried to engage her in conversation, feigning friendliness. Miriam was polite but cautious. The gesture of offering flowers seemed more confusing than welcoming to her. She thanked him and continued on her way, but he didn't stop following her. What happened next didn't appear on the camera footage, but later became clear through witness statements and Ranicorn's own confession. Under the influence of alcohol and controlled substances, he was unable to restrain his impulses. He bluntly suggested that Miriam accompany him to a secluded spot nearby, but her response was immediate. She refused, with a tone of fear creeping into her voice. She attempted to leave, quickening her pace, but Ranicorn persistently followed, her brisk steps eventually breaking into a run. At that moment, a surge of anger ignited within him, a fury directed not only at her, but also at himself, and a life that, in his mind, had long since lost its meaning. In this altered state, he was beyond reason. He caught up to her, grabbed her arm, and pulled her toward him roughly. Miriam screamed and tried to break free, but the area they were in was isolated, with no one around to hear her. He dragged her into the thick vegetation off the trail. Her struggle was intense, but in the end, she was overpowered. What began as a confrontation on the path ended in the shadows of the trees, where her cries faded into silence. When the police arrived at the scene several hours after her body was discovered, they immediately recognized that this was no random assault. The marks on Miriam's body showed signs of aggression, and the disturbed earth suggested a struggle. From the beginning, one thing was clear. After the incident, Ranicorn had likely retraced his steps down the same path, alone. The flower stall vendor had seen him as he passed by again. His clothes were stained and looked damp, and when asked if everything was okay, Ranicorn nervously replied that he had simply slipped. This strange response only heightened the vendor's suspicions, and the motorbike license plate he had noted became the key to solving the case. That evening, Ranicorn returned home. He quickly washed his clothes, but the stains didn't come out completely. He lay on his couch and turned on the TV, as if nothing had happened. Perhaps he thought that, by acting normally, he could put it all behind him, but that wasn't the case. When the police came to his door, he didn't attempt to hide. It was as if he understood that this was the end and was merely waiting to be found. Though he tried to maintain composure at the time of his arrest, it soon became clear that this calm was merely a mask, concealing confusion and fear. His eventual confession during questioning didn't surprise the officers, but it revealed a level of shocking cruelty that no one expected to uncover on this peaceful island. During the interrogation, Ranicorn broke down. At first, he attempted to mislead investigators, but his story fell apart, and eventually he started recounting what had happened in full detail. His confession stunned even the most seasoned detectives. The description of events unfolded like a nightmare set against a backdrop of tropical paradise. But the case didn't end with a simple confession. Authorities needed every detail of what had transpired. They decided to conduct a reenactment to understand exactly how the events unfolded. Ranicorn was brought back to the scene, his head covered with a bag to avoid public attention. Step by step, he demonstrated his actions, retracing his steps and showing each move. The officers observed his every gesture closely, searching for any details he might have omitted from his confession. The reenactment became a grim scene, as Ranikorn effectively replayed his disturbing role. When it was over, investigators had a complete picture of the events that had taken place on that ill-fated day. As the trial of Ranikorn Ramruin began, it was viewed as a test for the entire Thai justice system. The crime against young tourist Miriam Bild had shocked not only the local community, but also people abroad. Questions about safety for foreign visitors on islands like Koh Chang became more pressing, and authorities needed to demonstrate that justice would prevail. The court proceedings drew attention from both local and international media, with journalists capturing every detail while the public watched each day of the trial closely. Surveillance footage, the flower vendor's testimony, and Ranikorn's confession became undeniable evidence of his guilt. These pieces painted a clear picture of what had happened, how he tracked Miriam, attempted to engage her in conversation, and then followed her along the trail, leading her to a secluded area where he committed a terrible crime. Ranikorn's confession seemed like it should have answered every question. Yet the atmosphere in the courtroom remained tense. The circumstances of the crime, the brutality and coldness with which he acted, left even the most seasoned court reporters visibly disturbed. However, the real drama wasn't confined to the courtroom. The only person who tried to explain or at least understand Ranikorn's actions was his mother. Her appearance in court took everyone by surprise, and her emotional speech left mixed reactions among those present. She didn't defend her son, but instead tried to make sense of how something like this could happen, apologizing to Miriam's family and the community. She shared that she and her son had been estranged for years, unaware of his struggles with controlled substances. Her words felt like a search for some explanation of his actions, but were by no means an excuse. In the end, she pleaded with the court to punish him to the full extent of the law, acknowledging that her son had lost control of his life and posed a danger not only to himself, but to others. Ranikorn's confession came with no remorse. He did not apologize to the victim's family, nor did he attempt to explain what drove him to act. He simply recounted the events with a detached coldness, as if recounting someone else's story. Authorities moved swiftly to avoid prolonging the trial, and just 3 months after the tragedy, a verdict was delivered. Ranikorn Ramruin was sentenced to capital punishment. Efforts by his attorneys to seek leniency proved fruitless. The severity of the crime, the harrowing details, and the public outcry left no room for mercy. One of the most emotionally charged moments of the trial was his mother's statement. Her tears, despair, and realization that she had lost her son not only physically, but morally left a powerful impression on everyone present. She admitted her fear that, if he were ever released, he could repeat such a terrible act. Her final goodbye, watching her son as he was led into custody, was perhaps the most heartbreaking scene of the entire trial. She understood that he had forever lost his humanity, and this realization was the heaviest blow of all. After the verdict, the island of Koh Chang struggled to recover from the shock. Once known for its peace, tranquility, and natural beauty, it was now drawn into a horrific story that rattled the entire country. The locals, proud of their culture and hospitality, felt this tragedy deeply. To them, it was a blow to the reputation of the entire island, and they hoped this would remain an isolated incident, not a shadow cast over their beloved home. The community came together to show support for the family of the victim. People visited the spot where Miriam had been found, leaving flowers and candles as they bowed their heads in silent respect and mourning. This gesture symbolized not only their condolences, but also their desire to reject cruelty and ensure that such horrors would never happen again. But the tragedy exposed deeper issues. This story brought to light problems many preferred not to discuss. Tourist safety, the darker side of life on the islands, where easy access to controlled substances and a sense of impunity could lead to such outcomes. Authorities, recognizing this, moved quickly to bring closure to the case, and assured tourists and residents that the islands remained safe. Yet not everyone was convinced. Following the trial, police made a affirming that incidents like this would not happen again. and that Ko Chang remained a welcoming and secure destination. But could people truly forget that something so terrible had once taken place here? The story of Miriam Bild will remain one of the heaviest and most unforgettable incidents to have occurred on this island. In her memory, Hanover University established a scholarship for young engineers, ensuring that her name and passion for learning would continue despite the tragedy. But the pain of her loss stays with her loved ones, and those who knew and cared for Miriam will never be able to forget her. So here's something to consider. Who or what can guarantee that such a tragedy won't happen again? How can we be certain that our next journey won't turn into a nightmare, when even a paradise can hide its dark side? Think about this next time you plan a trip to distant places, for sometimes, behind the veil of beauty, there are things best left unknown. As the rain falls and the night deepens, thank you for being here with me at Radio Night Crime. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the need to stay aware, even in the stillness of the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the sound of the rain lull you to sleep, and until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep you company.